Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another ranking I'm redoing after 5 years, and here I'll be redoing a pretty special video, my most viewed video on this channel, where here I'll be redoing my Survivor US season ranking, where last time I did it, again 5 years ago, was immediately after Survivor Edge of Extinction, season 38. Now we're after Survivor 46, meaning we have 8 more seasons to rank here. Along with the fact that since that last season ranking, I've rewatched the majority of these seasons at some point in the last 5 years, and in general just have some differing opinions from what I used to have, to where even outside of just adding in these 8 new seasons, there will be some shifts in this list. Which again, unlike my winner ranking, which is very structured, very fact-based, this really isn't that. This is just purely how much I enjoy this season, how much personal attachment I have to the season. And also, before we get into it, I mean, straight up, like, I like every season of Survivor. I mean, Survivor is my favorite reality show of all time. Even the worst Survivor season is still better than even most average seasons of other reality shows. I think Survivor is just a genuinely really strong product the majority of the time, to where even the seasons at the bottom of this list are still seasons that I think have redeeming qualities and seasons I do still enjoy to a degree. But with that, let's get into the ranking itself. Starting it off at number 46, the worst season of Survivor US is one that, I'll be honest, I very much debated here. I think what was my lowest ranked season, my original season ranking, is something that was a bit controversial at the time, and coming into this ranking, I thought it would genuinely change, but then after thinking it more through, it didn't. And here at number 46, we do have Survivor, the Australian Outback. And again, Australian Outback here is a bit tough for me in the sense that, again, I think the big issue of the season is the fact that it's boring and it's really stretched out. It's a season that does have an extended episode count, kind of trying to bank off the popularity of the series at that point. And it really leads to this really elongated endgame that is just so boring with nothing happening, where the entire game is decided by the time of the final 10. Yeah, again, we still have to suffer through an hour-long episode for every single round following that. And again, even having the 2-hour finale with only the final 3 round is again just so boring. Now, again, I did very much debate putting this higher on the list this time. A lot of it comes from the fact that while this season is boring, it's a purely affable season. It's a season where there's not much icky going on. There's nothing really souring the overall tone of the show in the way that the next few seasons do. Where again, that was the debate. It's purely, what is worse? A season that, again, has some icky things happen, but also, like, again, have probably higher highs than something like Australian Outback for me. Or, again, being Australian Outback, which, again, is just kind of boring. And to me, again, I think when we're looking at reality TV, to me, boring is worse. Especially when, again, I don't feel like the season has that many true highs. Now, again, it has a mostly likable cast, obviously some big legendary figures on the season. Again, Colby and Jerry both are fantastic characters. Again, Tina ends up being a really great winner. You have Varner, who, again, specifically on this season, comes off as a really interesting villain. Michael Skupin is a really humorous character early on, again, not taking into the fact the stuff that happens afterwards, but again, him falling into fire is obviously one of the most iconic moments in the history of the show. But again, the season is just so mundane, with obviously a lot of it being focused on the survival aspects of the game. The overall strategy of the game is not particularly complex, with, again, the game being decided by the time of the merge. And while, again, there are some good character moments here and there, it's simply just not enough to really propel this season for me. So again, despite really considering it, I still do have this as the worst season of the show here at number 46. Now, number 45, the second worst season of the show, has also remained the same, and that season is Survivor Thailand. And again, with Survivor Thailand, there is, again, that massive debate for me, where Survivor Thailand is obviously a pretty icky season. It's a season with a lot of unlikable figures, and one with just a very dark tone to it. I mean, the entire Gandia situation obviously occurs, which is really unsettling to see, and also just the entire presence of Brian Heidik is something that also kind of sours the season. And again, with Brian winning, and him just being a very unlikable person, and I think those are definitely negative traits for this season, considering the fact that also Brian Heidik makes the gameplay of the season extremely boring. Again, it was so close to being at the very bottom. The reason it's not, though, is because I do find Thailand to be a funny season. If you're able to navigate through all the ickiness that's on this season, you do eventually find some gems in this season. Again, there are some hilarious moments in this season. From Bye Bye Denver Diva, you have the entire Attack Zone challenge, which is just one of my favorite sequences in the history of the show. You have Jan's reaction to the auction and Clay saying, "No shit, Sherlock." And again, there's so many like little funny moments across this season that do stand out quite a bit for me. To where, again, genuinely, I think if you were to rank these two seasons, having just finished watching them, I could definitely see a world where, yes, technically Australian Outback is a better season than Thailand. However, I just feel like when looking back on these seasons, when I look back at Australian Outback, I just remember how boring it is. For outside of certain quotes from Colby, it really just not a season that really sticks out to me from a character standpoint, while Thailand is one. Where while again, there are a lot of duds on this cast, I feel like, again, Clay is a really fun character, even though, again, kind of unlikable. And Rob Zabatnik is also a really insane character. And you also have some great confessionals from Xi'an. You have the fake merge. You do still have some interesting things here to where, again, while there is a lot of ickiness on this season and the gameplay is pretty rudimentary, I just feel like from a character standpoint, there are things that stand out a bit more for me on this season, which is why it's here at 45. Now, number 44. And straight up, this is a season that I actually thought was going to be at the bottom coming into this ranking. This is a season that I genuinely had as the worst season of the show before my final draft of this list. I think this is a season that I just recently rewatched, and it's terrible. It's a season that I just had no fun rewatching, to where this is a season that does take a pretty big drop from the last time I ranked this season. Again, last time I ranked this season, it was at number 30 out of 38. Now, again, it is the third worst season of the show. That season is Survivor All-Stars. And again, All-Stars just sucks. I mean, it's a season that, again, having just rewatched it, the main redeeming quality of this season is the fact that, one, there are returning players, and two, you have the story of Rob and Amber. Both of those don't really hold much weight. But again, yes, it's cool to see all these returning players back, but when you're seeing them all get taken out one by one and also be kind of lesser version of their original appearances, like, is it really that good? And mixing that in with the fact that, again, it's a Rob and Amber story to the point where it's so overexposed and just really predictable how the season's going to play out, to where, to me, it's like those aren't really as big of positives in the grand scheme of things. To where, again, mixing that with the fact that, again, there is a very sour tone to this season, and everyone just seems to be miserable out there, and all the big names get taken out early. Now, I will say, you do have the Lex Boston Rob situation, which I do think that is pretty much the true highlight of the season at this point, and is pretty much the reason that this is higher on the list than the last two entries. As, again, outside that, this is just a pretty soul-draining season, a season that just, again, no one is having fun. There's really no true interesting gameplay, and the season also really drags, because obviously it's a longer season, because they were trying to really milk as much as they could from this All-Star season. Also, you have the Sue situation, which, again, also is this massive negative taint on this season. The episode that she quits ends up being probably the worst episode in Survivor history for me, to where, again, it's a bad season. It's a season that, again, I thought would be the worst. I really hated my experience rewatching this season when I rewatched it for the retrospective. Yet, I think at the end of the day, again, in comparison to the last two seasons we talked about, there is at least more notable things from this. Again, the Rob Lex dynamic, the Rob and Amber storyline, again, obviously bigger characters due to the fact that the entire cast are returning players. Again, those are slivers of positivity there that etch it above the last two seasons, but again, not much more, to where it's here at 44. Now, number 43, we have the season that is pretty commonly talked about as the worst season. I feel like when you ask people online, what is the worst season of the show, this is commonly the answer. And obviously, there's a lot wrong about this season. Yet, again, I've never seen it as the very, very worst, and having just rewatched this season as well, I still stand by that opinion. At 43, I do have Survivor Island of the Idols. And again, IOI is bad. It is a bad season. And a lot of that obviously stems from the Dan Spilo situation, something that has a massive negative taint on the season. Again, it is a situation that really drags the season down at the merge, to the point where, again, you get one of the most uncomfortable episodes to watch in the second half of the merge episode. And then the more disturbing aspect of it is that Dan proceeds to still be on the season following that, and actually not being purpled somehow, still being on the show, getting confessionals, even getting a moment where they try to make you care about him having his son come out to family visit, which was all just very strange. Again, the overall portrayal of Dan on this season is bizarre, and again, just really ends up souring a lot of this season. However, that's not even the only negative. And again, most people, when they bring up the season, obviously bring up that situation. That's what this season is remembered for, and the main dock against this season. But in reality, the season's also just kind of dull for a decent chunk of it as well. Again, the post-merge is not that interesting for a lot of it. I mean, again, after the Kelly boot, you have Jamal being taken out and ends up being pretty much screwed. Him losing his vote at IOI. You also have this like stretch where Karishma is like the number one target, and she's not really able to escape that, which is just, again, not particularly interesting to see. So again, the season doesn't really pick back up until the finale. Again, the finale is great. Again, the rest of the post-merge is just so mediocre. However, I think something to prop the season up is the fact that I do think the first half of the season is pretty solid. Again, it's a pretty good first half. Specifically, I think episodes 6 and 7 are both very, very good episodes. Also, I think as a whole, this is a solid cast, where this was the first cast made after the departure of Lynn Spillman, with it having this more diverse cast that you would expect from the new era. And that does lead to some pretty inspired casting choices on this season. So again, while you still get some duds along the way from the likes of Jack and and Elizabeth and debatably Tommy, obviously Dan. But again, like, I still think as a whole, this is a pretty strong cast. So I think there are redeeming factors to IOI. Again, obviously the dance situation is why it's this low. Again, it just completely sinks your opinion of the season. To where, again, if the dance situation didn't happen, I mean, this would be probably at least 7 or 8 spots higher on this list. But again, that situation does happen. And again, it's really hard to separate that from this season. But again, when you do, you're able to find, again, a few good moments here and there. And with episodes 6, 7, and the finale all being actually genuinely great episodes, which is why it's enough to be here at number 43. Now, number 42. And now we're moving on to a season that I never particularly like, yet this is a season that has actually dropped even more since my last ranking. And it's a season that I've also recently rewatched. To where, again, my negative feelings on this season kind of were backed up on the rewatch, and that season is Survivor Ghost Island. And again, Ghost Island is just kind of the epitome of the issue with the late 30 seasons. A season that just felt very uninspired, a season that just felt like they shoehorned in this theme for the sake of having a theme because they need a theme to brand the show off of. To where, while a lot of people will criticize recent seasons for just going by the number and not being distinct enough from each other, and that people want themes back, I actually don't want themes back. I'm someone that, again, I think this is a perfect example of why you should not have themes. And 2 for IOI is also an example of that as well. But again, Ghost Island is just a theme that just makes no sense. It's simply just here for the sake of having a theme. Again, it is cool to have these callbacks to previous advantages and us getting to talk about the history of the show. However, the issue is the fact that how these advantages are doled out and what powers they have are just really arbitrary. And also just, again, the functionality of Ghost Island is also very arbitrary, where just for some reason at points you can play a game, but other points you can't. Oh, that's really dumb. But also the main reason why this season is so low is because this cast sucks. This is the worst modern Survivor cast by a mile. And again, I think Survivor is a show that has been doing a very good job at casting. So again, as much as people will criticize how happy-go-lucky the recent casts have been, I feel like it hasn't been the biggest issue for me. And again, just looking even beyond that to the late 30s, I feel like a lot of those seasons have pretty solid casts. The exception is Ghost Island, where again, for some reason, this feels like a cast that was back from the early 20s. A cast that has so many people that just are just complete duds and seemingly just there because they're attractive people. Again, people like a Libby, a Jenna, a Sebastian, a Chelsea. I mean, Angela is there. Again, like, there's so many non-factors on this season. And obviously part of that is obviously due to the editing not really backing them up. But I feel like it didn't back them up because they simply had nothing to provide to begin with. But again, this ends up being a season that is so primarily focused around a small group of characters. Again, obviously you got Dom and Wendell who run the show, and Dom in particular is a great character and a really interesting player to watch. But again, even Wendell is not particularly entertaining on this season outside of his voting confessional to Chris Noble. And you have Chris Noble, who's an incredible character, obviously. But then outside of that, again, you got the likes of Donathan, you got Michael, you got Kellen, who all got big edits, despite the fact that they're just kind of fine. So again, when you have Jacob Derwin, the second boot of the season, being in the top half of confessional getters on this season, again, I think you have a problem. Again, Ghost Island to me just, it doesn't work. I think it's a bad cast. I think it also is a bad twist. And mixing that with the fact that also the gameplay is very stagnant for the majority of the season, it really just leaves the season with very little to prop itself up by. So again, it's a season that, when remaking the list for this video, I just feel like it just became even more clear to me that this is one of the worst seasons in the history of the show. And again, especially when you take out the seasons that have very notoriously icky aspects about them, Ghost Island is essentially the second worst season on this list at this point, which again, I fully stand by. I think Ghost Island sucks, and it's here at number 42. Now number 41, and this is going to be an interesting spot, as this is the first new era season we have to talk about here. And also, this is a radical departure from how I talked about the season when the season ended. When the season ended, I talked about this as the best new era season, that this is a step in the right direction. However, in retrospect, I think it's the opposite. I think it is the worst new era season by a lot, and that is Survivor 44. And Survivor 44 is a season that, again, at the time, I really loved. I love Jam Jam. I love Carolyn. I thought the entire story of the Tika 3 was, again, while very obvious, again, was still really interesting to see. And in general, this is a very likable cast. It's probably one of the most likable casts in history of the show. But that's kind of the issue. It's too likable to the point where there's really no conflict on this season. It's a very mundane season from beginning to end, to where while you have, again, iconic characters from Jam Jam and Carolyn, that's about all you have in terms of these truly elite characters, to where no one else really stands out to me here. For a while, again, yeah, you have someone like a Danny who gets a big edit and plays pretty aggressively. You have even a Matthew, again, who comes off as this very aggressive player. You have Matt and Franny, who are very likable presences, and I always personally like Josh as a character, but really a lot of the rest of this cast is just not particularly interesting. And you have like people like Heidi, you got Lauren Harp, you have Brandon, you have Kane, you have Sarah Wade, you have Helen, you just have so many people here that just do not bring much to the table. So we're mixing out the fact that also the gameplay of the season is actually really dull, where again, the Tiga 3 play very well. Again, they play the middle very impressively. However, there's really no big moment in this season. There's no big move that the season's going to be remembered by. There's no big blindside on this season, simply because again, which again just makes the season not particularly interesting from a gameplay front also. And mixing out the fact that again, first half of the season was probably the worst the New Era has ever been in terms of how many twists there were and how they were constantly throwing them in your face, with it really feeling like this was a season where players were not given a single moment to breathe and play a more natural game until the final 10. And again, this is another season that I did just recently rewatch, and it just further cements my opinion on this season. I just feel like it's a season that has not aged well. So again, in retrospect, I think the only thing it has really going for it are Jam Jam and Carolyn as characters. Well, outside that, just everything else is just not interesting. The gameplay's not interesting. Only like a third of the casts are interesting. While also, the story of the Tiga 3 is something that is so foreshown that it really takes away from the season. To where again, Survivor 44 is just simply not that good in retrospect, to where that's why it's here at number 41. Now, number 40, we're moving on to a season that I am mostly conflicted on. I think there are good aspects to this season, particularly certain characters, yet there's also a lot of negatives of this season, particularly the fact that the gameplay is very stagnant and the fact that a good chunk of the cast are complete duds, where again I was very unsure where to land this season. But here at number 40 we do have Survivor One World. Now, One World, I will say, I do think there are reasons to have it lower. I do think the entire Colton of it all is something that is a bit of a negative tint on the season, to where while it does lead to some chaoticness in the fact that again he has the Men tribe give up their immunity to go to tribal, which is pretty insane, and also him being medevaced in the way that he does is kind of an oddly satisfying ending to his arc for me. He still ends up being again a negative presence on this season. And again, the other negative is the fact that obviously the gameplay's not the most dynamic in the world. Obviously, this is a season that Kim Spradlin runs the game from beginning to end, has no difficulty in the game, plays the most dominant game in Survivor history. Again, all that is very impressive, but again, not good TV. To where, again, I understand why people would have this season lower. I used to have this season lower. The reason I do have it a bit higher now is because I do think there are some great character moments from the season. Again, having rewatched portions of the season since my last ranking, I've really grown to love the Merge episode in particular, where I think there's so much great Tarzan content from that episode. And just in general, Tarzan is an insane character. But we also have someone like a Cat who is a fun character. Sabrina has her moments. I really like Troyzan's underdog run, where again, some people are pretty conflicted on it, though I still think that This Is My Island moment is still a pretty humorous TV moment for me. And in general, again, I think this is a pretty humorous season of the show. I think there are some great character moments within it. I think there is some intrigue early on too, with the One World twist and how different that portion of the season is from anything we had seen before. So again, I think there are good aspects to the season. Now again, at the end of the day, it's not particularly great. And like, truth be told, I mean, this going up on the list is largely because again, certain other seasons have gone down more so than this truly going up. But again, I do definitely have more respect for this season and its characters as time goes on, despite the fact that again, there's also a decent amount of duds on this cast. But again, at the end of the day, I think there's enough positive here to leave it here at number 40. Now, number 39, we're moving on to a season that I loved at the time. I remember at the time, this was a season that I looked at as one of the best in the history of the show, which has not aged well at all. To where while this season definitely has a high point, it really has probably one of the worst stretches of episodes in the history of the show, especially when, again, for not icky reasons. And that season is Survivor Caramoan. And again, the pre-merge of Survivor Caramoan is just really rough. Not even because there's not necessarily anything happening. There are things happening, just really none of it feels particularly entertaining. I mean, like, on their fans tribe, you do have like Shamar being this big character, getting into confrontations. On the fans tribe, you have the wackiness from Philip. And also you have his feud with Brandon Hanskin. Stuff is happening, but it feels like none of this stuff that's happening is particularly fun. It again just feels like it has this kind of like negative tint to it that makes it less interesting. Well, also again, you have so many duds on the fans tribe, with obviously the entire fans tribe feeling like a group of random people, most of which were not actual fans, and through that did not even make for the Grace TV, with them again just simply coming off as fodder for the favorites, to where obviously the favorites just completely run this season. Again, they face almost no real adversity in getting a numbers advantage, and for even when we do have Malcolm flipping on the favorites and again creating some of the better moments of the season in the Three Amigos tribal, and the hold up Reynolds moment. It's again, that's simply just not really enough to escalate the season much more than this. So again, I think it's a season that again has these great moments. So again, I think the post-merge is actually pretty strong. Again, you got the Corinne blindside, you got the hold up Reynolds moment, you got Three Amigos tribal, you have the Andrea blindside, you have the eventual Brenda blindside. Again, all really strong moments, but also you have such a foreshown outcome where it was so obvious Cochran is winning this entire season. You also got a really dull finale with almost nothing going for it, with it just being a foregone conclusion there. You also have, again, just that really bad pre-merge, and also just a really lackluster cast. A cast that does not feel to the caliber that a fans versus favorite cast should be, to where, again, it's a largely lackluster season, to where while it does, again, have those high points that elevate it to this point in the list, simply just not good enough to not be considered a bottom tier season of the show. So that's why it's here, number 39. Now, number 38. Moving on to a season that, I'll be honest, this was pretty close to Caramoan. I actually think there's a serious argument that Caramoan is better. However, I do think this is a season that is a little bit more consistent in Caramoan, even though it probably has a bigger icky moment, and that season is Survivor Game Changers. And Survivor Game Changers, again, is a tough season here because I do think the Zeke situation definitely sours the season a bit. Obviously, the moment itself is just very upsetting to watch, but the fact that it has these like major long-term ramifications on Zeke's run on this season, the fact that you can very much tell how much this messed with Zeke's mindset, and also seem to put a bigger target on Zeke's back, with people seeming to target him because of him now having this story, where again, it does lead to some ickiness there in the middle portion of the game. However, again, there are still some really interesting votes on this season. Now, I will say that I do think the post-merge is just kind of a mess, where I think the editing is just very sloppy. You have a lot of these votes that aren't like properly explained. But again, like the Debbie blindside's pretty good. The Michaela blindside's obviously very chaotic. You do have Advantage Get-In, which again is a mixed bag thing for me. I think it's an interesting TV moment, though obviously it's a very game-breaking TV moment. I think obviously has negative ramifications for the balancing of the game, which just in general also, I feel like this is kind of the season that makes it very clear the direction that Modern Survivor is going in. Again, having a heavy focus on advantages while also having a heavy focus on personal journeys, with us seeing the Cirie balance beam moment here, which I really feel like is this encapsulating moment for Jeff's current view of the show. So again, there's pros and cons here, but I think the thing that does elevate it above Caramoan in particular is that I do think we get a good start to the season. Again, I do think the run of Tony on this season is really entertaining, to where while he's out by episode 2, really technically part 2 of the premiere, it's still a really entertaining ride, and mixing out the fact that we get an all-time great tribal in the Malcolm Boot tribal, which is still one of the most riveting series of events in the show's history. It really does escalate the season in a spot where, again, there's definitely ickiness, there's definitely some, again, questionable casting choices on this season, and again, there's definitely some not as great portions to the season. Yeah, again, I think it is the early portion of the season, with the season, again, essentially up to the JT boot being a really strong stretch of episodes, and the fact that you get a couple good blindsides towards the end, it's good enough to put it here number 38. Now, number 37, we have a season that for a while was pretty much the consensus worst season of the show, where until IOI happened, when you asked most of the online community what is the worst season, this would be the answer, and I just straight up disagree. At number 37, I do have Redemption Island. And again, Redemption Island is a season that I've always just personally liked. Again, I do understand the criticisms with it. Obviously, Redemption Island has a twist, just sucks. Well, obviously, we've seen worse since then. I do feel like still not an ideal format for the show. Also mixing the fact that Boss Rob just steamrolls the season, dominates the game from beginning to end. Again, that is definitely a criticism for most people. I do find Boss Rob dominating the season actually be an interesting aspect of the season, both in the fact that Boss Rob in himself is an incredible character, one of the best confessionalists in the history of the show, and just a really entertaining player to watch. And again, I think that's what adds to the entertainment value of him on this season. The fact that he is able to dominate the game from beginning to end. And through that, we get to see the inner workings of his game and seeing him get to lay out exactly how he's doing every little thing, to where while it does leave Boss Rob being very overexposed on this season, I still think it leads to that being a massive pro for this season. And taking that out of it, I also feel like this is a pretty funny season. And taking that out of it, I'm still pretty entertained by other aspects of this season. Again, I do think the fall of Russell in the early portion of the season is really great. The premiere in general is a fantastic episode, one of the best premieres in Survivor history. Obviously, Philip is a massive character, while a lot of people find him very unlikable. Again, I still found him entertaining here. I've always liked certain understated characters on this season, from like Steve, who has some humorous moments. Stephanie Valencia is a pre-merger I've always personally liked. The Merge episode is also another really strong episode. One of the, really just a masterclass from Boston Rob's point of view, to where, again, I do like this season. I get why people don't. However, again, for me, I do seem to like the cast more than most people do, I guess. And it's down to the fact that, again, I think Boss Rob running the game is portrayed in an interesting way for me, at least, to where mixing all that in, the fact that I do have a personal connection to this season, with this being one of my most rewatched seasons from back in the day. I do, again, connect this season more than what it seems like most people do, to where it's here number 37. Now, number 36. And now we're going back to a new era season of the show. Again, a season we haven't talked about in a season ranking before. And this is one that, in my opinion, of the season goes up and down constantly. Really, if it was not for my latest rewatch of the season, I do think it actually would have been higher on the list. Yet, having rewatched the season, my opinion of it went down a bit, and that season is Survivor 43. And Survivor 43 is a tough season here in the sense that I really liked it when it was airing. I actually really enjoyed most of its run, to where I think the season does have a interesting cast with some really kooky characters, and having some really fun rivalries here from the likes of like Owen and James. You have Ellie and Gabler. You obviously have the Jesse Cody dynamic, and again, the Cody blindside is one of the best moments in the new era and telenovela. That episode is probably in the conversation for best episodes of the new era. So again, there's good in that sense. However, again, my opinion of the season has gone down over time, and after rewatching the season, it kind of cemented the fact that, while again, I think this is a pretty consistent season. It's a season that doesn't really have any true, like, really, really low points. It's also a season that has no real high points outside of the Cody blindside. Where I think outside that, the post-merge phase of the game is just pretty stable, where I feel like it's a season that is just so baseline throughout the majority of it, making it just like kind of so painfully average by the end of it, to where, again, there's not really a slow point on this season. Again, I don't think there's a point in this season where it gets anywhere close to any of the lows that we get from any of the seasons we talked about so far, but also, again, in comparison to the last few seasons that we've talked about, really likes of like Game Changers and Karamoa, and again, this season doesn't have as many high points as those seasons. So again, the Cody blindside is fantastic, but I feel like that's most of what this season has going for it from a gameplay perspective, and really just a general storytelling perspective. I feel like this season's just a bit of a mess, where I feel like the editing of the strategy on this season is just kind of all over the place, with a lot of it just not being properly explained. I feel like it's an edit that you can very clearly tell that production was very pissed at the fact that they got the final three that they had, and through that, it feels like so much of the focus in the edit goes into propping up Jesse and Carla and Cody, to the point where the final three themselves just feel kind of lackluster, to where while there are definitely signs for a Gabler winner edit throughout the entire season, even more so than what I remembered having seen them through my latest rewatch, that's still not enough to make the Gabler win a satisfying ending to the season. So again, I think 43 is a bit of a mess of a season. It's a season that does avoid a lot of the low lows that you would expect from a season this low on the list, but it also just has very few of those high highs, where the Cody blindside is really the only thing holding it up. Again, for me, because of that, I feel like it's a struggle to put it much higher on the list, to where that's why it's here at number 36. Now number 35, we're moving on to a season that's always been very difficult to rank, a season that is obviously held in a very high regard by a certain portion of the fan base. I'm not really part of that portion of the fan base, yet despite that, I do still have a lot of reverence for that season, and that season is the first season of the show, Survivor Borneo. And Borneo is a season that, again, you have obviously these people that talk about it's the best season ever because it's the first, because you have to have it highly ranked. But then there's also the other side of the fan base that, again, people think that it's old, so it's boring, and rank it low. Again, I'm kind of in neither of those camps. Again, obviously this is relatively low on the list. However, again, as I said, I think most Survivor seasons are good, to the point where, again, I think Borneo is still a genuinely great season of reality television. I think it's a season that has a really great cast. I think there are some really great characters on this season. Obviously, it is the foundation of Survivor, and through that, you get some really interesting aspects to this show. The fact that we see the foundation of strategy and see the concept of alliance really work to perfection here is, again, interesting to see from my point of view. Again, I understand how people say, oh, it's a begonging and it's boring after Gretchen vote. Yeah, again, I still think that portion of the season is really interesting, where, again, the alliance itself is still not even really having the numbers, and we see them having to latch on to Sean's alphabet strategy, which is interesting. We also get, again, some really insane character moments from the likes of Sean. We obviously have Sue's Snakes and Ratch speech, which is insane, which, again, is still one of the greatest moments in the history of the show. Hatch as a character is also really strong. Rudy has some great one-liners. The entire Pagong group is a very likable group of people on this season. Greg is also an insane character. So I do find Borneo to be a mostly consistent season. I think it's a season that, while again, the focus of the show is very different from what we get in the modern day, I think it really excels at being this novelty, to where, again, in comparison to something like Australian Outback, where, again, Australian Outback I just find outright boring, I feel like Borneo is able to avoid feeling that way, especially considering how you really see a lot of the stepping stones for Survivor history on this season, which again elevates it for me personally. I can understand how it doesn't for other people and they do have it lower ranked. Yet, for me, I still feel like this is, again, a solid cast. But again, a lot of intrigue from just seeing how the show started, which is enough to put it here for me at number 35. Now, number 34, we're moving on to a season that my opinion of the season continuously drops as time goes on. I believe this was a decent chunk higher on my previous list. Yet, to be fair, this is a season that I haven't rewatched in a decent amount of time. I'll actually be rewatching it pretty soon. That season is Survivor Palau. And Palau as a whole seems to be a very popular season. I know at the time it was a very popular season. It was kind of this revival for Survivor, being this kind of proof that Survivor can have a successful season after Survivor All-Stars, to where, again, it was a popular season at the time, and I think when you look at the online community, there, again, definitely are these massive supporters of the season. And a lot of that comes from the fact that, again, this is a pretty unique season in Survivor history. It's actually probably the season where challenge wins matter the most, not just through individual immunity challenge wins, where obviously Tom wins 5 of them and goes on to win the season, being safe for the majority of the game there, but also through tribal challenge wins, where Koror wins every single immunity challenge and completely oolongs the oolongs, to where that at least is different dynamic for the show. However, I don't like that dynamic personally. So again, I don't think it's interesting to see a tribe get decimated and have only one person left by the time the merge. Again, that's just really lame. To see the same people go to tribal over and over and over again and leave us in the end game with all these Korors still together, having an overwhelming majority and in a spot where a majority of them shouldn't even made the merge to begin with, where they were people that would have normally been picked off early on most given other seasons. To where, while people do very much praise that aspect of the season, and to be fair, again, it's a unique aspect of the season, it doesn't make for good TV from my point of view, outside of, again, just the notion of Stephanie being the last one standing from Oolong. However, I will say, I do think this season does have some interesting characters, obviously. Again, you still have Stephanie and Bobby John, who have really interesting runs on this season. Again, Tom is a really satisfying winner from this season, even though you can question some of his actions nowadays. You have this really interesting arc for Ian and his downfall. You also have, again, great confessionals from Katie. You get entertainment from Karen, where, again, while she's not particularly likable, again, she still makes for entertaining TV, to where you also have Kobe, who makes for good TV. James Miller's a great early on character, to where, again, like, I think this is a decent enough cast. And also, again, if you're into challenges, this is probably one of the best challenge seasons of the show. Not just in the fact that, again, they play a major role on the season, but also this season has a lot of good challenges. Again, there's a lot of, like, really iconic challenges that stem from this season. So again, there is stuff to praise from this season. I think the issue is that the things that you praise from the season are the things that I don't personally care about. So while I do, you get a really interesting endgame stretch, where from the final 6 on, it's a pretty entertaining ride. And again, you also have the most entertaining final immunity challenge in the history of the show. It just simply is not enough for me to make it this truly elite season. A certain portion of the fan base seem to look at this as, to where, again, for me, it's simply good enough to be here, number 34. Now, number 33. And now we're moving on to a season that I think I've become also notoriously known as having this season very low, not liking this season. And again, on this ranking here, technically the season's higher than what it used to be. It's still relatively low on the list, yeah. But at this point, it's almost out of the bottom third, for whatever that's worth. And that season is Survivor Cook Islands. And, I mean, my opinion of Cook Islands has not really changed. I feel like I stand by a lot of things I said. Again, I think Cook Islands is a season that most of the cast is extremely underwhelming, while you do have these really big names are really great TV, from the likes of Yul, Ozzy, Penner, and, like, some moments from the likes of, like, Parvati and Candace, and, like, some underrated characters from the likes of, like, Nate and Cowboy. It's still a season where I feel like at least half this cast are pretty much just duds that don't bring anything to the table. Again, are very clearly recruited to fit into this racial theme, to where, again, I do respect this season from the fact that it obviously brought a lot of diversity to Survivor, where obviously having this race war season forced them to have a cast of 75% POC, and again, that was really cool to see, but it's also based around a race war theme, which is really surreal. Remember that Survivor did this so early on in its run, to where that's a strange aspect of it, and it bleeds into my other criticisms of this season. The fact that there's some very clear riggage on this season, from, again, the entire bottle twist, and in that, while the I24 storyline is definitely one of the bigger pros of the season, and it is a really great story to see this tribe that was down to only 4 against 8, and they end up being the final 4 of the season. Again, that is a really interesting storyline. If it didn't feel manufactured. To where, again, it very much feels like production was putting their hands in the pot a bit and trying to help the I-24 succeed. With, again, the inclusion of the bottle twist, to where you can clearly tell production was very much worried about this doomsday scenario of all the white people running the show, which, again, would not have been a good look for this season. To where I feel like that's something that detracts from the season as well to me. And in general, again, I think it's a season that, am I higher on it than the last time I did the ranking? Maybe slightly. I do think, again, Story of the I-24 is a very notable one. I do really like Yule and Penner as TV presences. Obviously, Ozzy has a really iconic run on this season. And again, you get some great moments from, again, Yule flipping Penner. You have, like, Plan Voodoo. You have Billy Garcia. Again, there are some great moments here, but I just feel like as a whole, I do think this is a largely overrated season by a decent chunk of the fan base where, again, the majority of this cast is so mundane and just feel like fodder, particularly in the first 2/3 of the season, where, again, we get a late merge on this season as well. And even then, again, the end game also kind of drags once Penner's gone, to where I don't think this is a great season. Yeah, I think there are aspects of the season I respect more as time goes on, and that's why it's here at number 33. Now number 32, and now we're getting back to another New Era season, this being a season that I did not love at the time that it aired, despite the fact that it seemed like a majority of the fan base seemed to love it. Like, I remember at the time, people were talking about this as being a top 10 season of the show, and I thought those people were genuinely insane. Again, having time gone on, and having also rewatched the season, I do feel like my opinion of the season is probably slightly higher than what it was at the time the season finished, but it's still not particularly high, and that season is Survivor 42. And again, Survivor 42 is a season that I get why people like it. Obviously, you have Marianne being this really satisfying winner for the season. And as a whole, again, it is a pretty likable cast. Again, you do have some other great characters from the likes of Omer. You have Mike. You have Jonathan playing an interesting role in this season. Even Lindsay comes to her own as a character by the end. You have Drea and Hai, who are these big presences for a decent chunk of the season. You have even like a Tori, who's a pretty fun character. Roxroy is a pretty humorous character at points. Even early on, again, you got like a Zach, who's a really interesting first boot. You have the entire Jenny Kim tribal, which is one of the best tribals in the New Era, to where, again, I think those are things to praise from this season, and I get why people praise those things. However, it's also a pretty mundane season gameplay-wise for me. Again, I think this is a really lackluster season gameplay-wise, or again, it feels like a season kind of devoid of really big moves and really big gameplay moments, where while you do get the Omer blindside at the very end, at the final 6, outside of that, I mean, you really have the Jenny Kim tribal, and even that's something that is very much perpetuated by all the New Era BS that's thrown into the game, to where I do think the first half of the post-merge is just so mundane. This big super alliance coming together and essentially just running the show early on, where, again, High Boot is an episode that really gets propped up as this big blindside, yet for me it was just entirely boring. So while you do get, again, a good moment from like Drea going out, and you have the Knowledge's power play, it's just a portion of the season that is just not entertaining to me. And again, I think at the end of the day, this is a cast that is also pretty inconsistent. Again, while I named a lot of people that I think are interesting TV, a lot of people I didn't name aren't particularly good TV, which is almost half the cast. And also, it's a season that still continues on with the dumb format that we got from Survivor 41, which, again, we'll talk about 41 eventually, but it's funny how people talk about 42 being this massive improvement over 41 when it has just as bad of a format as 41 and less interesting gameplay from my point of view. So again, we still get the Hourglass twist. We still get Do or Die. We still get a late split tribal. So again, I do think this is a season that is very much overhyped by a decent chunk of the fan base, to where, again, I think there are good aspects to the season for sure. Again, there are some pretty great characters on this season. And again, there are a couple big moments, but for me at the end of the day, it's not really enough to hold it in particularly high regard. But again, I think in comparison to the seasons we've talked about so far, I think it is largely on par with something like a Cook Islands or Palau, which is why it's here at number 32. Now number 31, we're going from one of the more recent seasons of the show to one of the oldest seasons of the show. A season that, despite a lot of aspects of the season being something that I shouldn't particularly like, I do like this season despite those things, and that season is Survivor Africa. And again, Survivor Africa is a season that does a lot of focusing on the survival aspects of the show. Again, we spent a lot of time seeing these people acclimate to the conditions in Africa and see how terrible their living conditions are. But I actually don't mind it on this season, which is a very strange aspect of Survivor Africa in the sense that on paper it has a lot of these things that I shouldn't like from Survivor. Again, it has the entire cast being depleted due to how terrible the conditions are, along with us focusing a lot on those conditions. Yeah, I think it adds the kind of the uniqueness of the season for me. Start mixing that and the fact that I do think we get some pretty interesting other moments on the show. Again, we get this like really split dynamic on Samburu to where it's a 4v4 between the young and the old, and I think that's interesting to see there. We get an interesting run from Clarence, who, again, while is treated pretty poorly in a bit of an icky way from Big Tom, I do feel like he still ends up providing a lot of entertainment, particularly through the controversy in episode 1. And we also get a pretty interesting post-swap phase where, again, Ethan throwing the immunity challenge to take out Silas is really interesting. The Kelly vote is probably the most interesting vote off up to this point in Survivor history, maybe outside of the Gretchen vote. But again, there's a lot to like from Africa here. However, again, the thing that does keep it lower on the list is I do think the gameplay of the Mac portion of the season gets pretty mundane. Really, from the final 7 on is, again, not the most riveting TV there, along with the fact that there are a decent amount of duds on this cast. People that I don't think really bring that much to the table. But again, you still really get some great moments here. Again, the big 3 of the season, Ethan, Big Tom, and Lex, are all really interesting characters in their own different ways. You also have T-Bird, who's a great character on this season. Frank, while again not likable, again ends up having some moments here and there. Kelly Goldsmith's a great character. Again, I always like Clarence, as I said. Or again, Silas, not particularly likable, but again, a good pre-merge villain alongside Lindsay. Where again, I think there's a lot to like from Survivor Africa. It's where, while it is an earlier season of the show, and again has slow pacing because of that, and also again has a lot of focus on the conditions, I feel like a lot of that isn't that bad on this season. To where, as a whole, again, I do like this season, particularly due to how unique of a season it feels like. It's enough to put it here at number 31. Now, at number 30, we're moving on to a season that has dropped significantly on this list, where this is a season that I used to have in the top half of the ranking. Yet, as time goes on, my opinion of the season just continues to go down, and again, my latest rewatch of the season was not particularly great, to where at number 30, I do have Survivor The Amazon, which is a season that is, again, typically lauded by the Survivor community. Again, it's looked at as one of the funniest seasons of the show. It's a season that also evolved the strategy of the game to where, again, I think for a while you would commonly see this as a top 10 season of the show, and even I myself looked at it as like a top 15 season for quite a while. Yeah, again, I do think as time goes on, my opinion of the season starts to slip. But again, in my latest rewatch of the show, which I did for the retrospective, I kind of realized that this season just simply has not aged well. I feel like there are a lot of aspects of this season that just simply are not as entertaining as what they used to be. Again, in a time back in the day where a lot of these jokes about gender dynamics would have potentially been funny, and that's simply just not funny anymore. And a lot of it just comes off very dated and also just, again, kind of icky at points. Also just kind of awkward at points. So while I still do really like Rob Cesternino as a character on this season, I think he's a great narrator. I also feel like a lot of his jokes just, again, don't really work anymore. Along with all the constant talk from the men about how they want to hook up with the women, and all the focus on the women bathing or stripping for chocolate and peanut butter. Again, all these things just simply have not aged well. To where, again, I think those aspects of the season are just genuinely bad, which kind of makes the pre-merge of the season just outright bad. But again, there's really not much of intrigue going on in the pre-merge. It really is a lot focused on this men versus women dynamic. To where, again, when that simply just does not hold in the modern day, it makes a lot of the pre-merge just kind of bad. To where, again, the season does get better in the post-merge. Again, I do think the evolutionary gameplay from Rob Cesternino is really what elevates the season to being a still competent season. Again, it's still this really interesting stretch of the season where we see these flips left and right in the game. Again, Dina being sniped from the Majority Alliance, only for Rob to flip on Alex, and then him to flip back to take out Christy, and then flipping back to take out Heidi. And again, it's really interesting gameplay to see, but I also feel like when all this leads up to a Jenna win with her just winning out at the end, I like that's kind of underwhelming from my point of view. But again, it's still a solid season as a whole. It's not a bad season of reality television. I just think it's one that, again, has not aged the greatest. For all I still think there are these iconic moments here and there, it simply has not aged as well as I would have liked it to. So again, at the end of the day, I do have it here number 30. Now, number 29, we're moving on to a season that is another one that is very lauded by aspects of the online community. This commonly being talked about as this big, classic season. And to be fair, I can understand why. I always feel like it's been a season that's a bit overhyped, and that season is Survivor Gabon. And again, Survivor Gabon is a season that, yes, it is a pretty wacky season. There are some pretty insane characters on this season, from the likes of Sugar, the likes of Randy, the likes of even like Kenny. You got Ace, you got GC, you got Crystal Cox, you got Corinne, who has great confessionals at points. Again, again, you do have a pretty wacky cast here, along with the fact that the game plays out in a somewhat surprising way, and the fact that we get Bob getting to the end seemingly completely by accident and ends up winning there, all while we have like Marcus getting sniped out during a second swap, and we have the fake idol play when Randy goes out, which is obviously an iconic moment, and obviously just a lot of hectic gameplay for like the Sugar and even Kenny, to where, again, I get why people like this season. Again, I do like this season. However, again, I don't like it as much as these big supporters of the season. To where, again, it's a good season. It is a season where, yes, the typical norms you would expect from Survivor don't necessarily happen here. However, again, I think the overall hecticness of this season is a bit overblown, to where, well, yes, again, Marcus, this person who you think is going to run the show from beginning to end, doesn't run the show from beginning to end. You still do have this near pagonging in the post-merge, to where it's not like the game is shifting left and right and the game is super dynamic. It's like, that's not really the case. Again, the entire post-merge is essentially this pagonging of the former Coda Alliance, to where Bob survives because he wins immunities. But again, I don't think that's as crazy as people say it is. And even outside that, again, just the general gameplay of the season is not that interesting. Where, again, even when Marcus gets taken out, he's getting taken out because he gets swap screwed. It's not like this big revolt happens where the outsiders get together to snipe him out. He simply gets sniped out because he gets swapped into a bad position to begin with. So again, Gabon does have some funny character moments. It's also, again, a unique season, taking place in Africa, but having a pretty radically different tone to that of Survivor Africa, to where, again, I still like this season, and it is a mostly consistent ride. However, it's a season that I feel like I just personally don't really connect with as much as certain other seasons of the show, and that's why it's here at number 29. Now, number 28, moving on to a season that I do connect a bit more with, where this has always been a season that I've personally enjoyed more than what the majority of the fan base seems to where, again, there was a point where I remember this was a season that was commonly talked about. It's one of the worst seasons of the show, to where I do think the reception to the season has grown over time, and for me, again, it lands nearing the middle of the list here, and that season is Survivor Fiji. And again, I like Survivor Fiji. Again, Fiji is a season that, while the cast is borderline bad, it's very much a Cook Island situation where a lot of this cast were recruits. Obviously, a lot of this cast were essentially the leftovers from the casting process for Survivor Cook Islands, putting on a lot of people that they found through the process of casting for Cook Islands and transitioning into this season, which again is kind of lame on paper. Yeah, I feel like we do get some intrigue from how this plays out. We again get a more diverse cast on this season, one that does allow for the first ever all black alliance to truly form and actually play a factor on this season, which again, it's not really portrayed on the show in that way, but again, we at least know what happened from Bo's show. And I think that's kind of a weird aspect of the season, is that it does feel like two of the major storylines of the season being the fact that, again, there was this all black alliance, and also the fact that there was this explorers versus builders dynamic at the beginning that really ends up shaping how the season plays out. None of that is properly explained on the show, which is very strange, but still, I feel like it is a season that plays out in a really fun way, to where, again, while the have not twist at the beginning of the season is really stupid, and again, I think that's a portion of the season that's kind of bad, again, very similar to like the Palau of these people seemingly just having no real shot, and probably, to be fair, worse than Palau, as again, this feels like production just openly screwing them over. And by the time we get to the swap, I feel like the season becomes a lot better. I feel like we get these interesting dynamics at the swap with the creation of the Four Horsemen. We get Lacey being this very strange character on her way out. We get Rocky being this massive character, even though, again, not particularly likable at points. And again, we get to emerge where I think we get a lot of interesting stuff, to where while people don't like the Michelle vote, I still think it's a really interesting vote off, even though, again, a bit unfair. But also we get, obviously, the Edgardo blindside, one of the best blindsides in Survivor up to this point. And along with that, we get the first ever successful idol play later in the season, where Yao ends up using it at the final 6. We get the entire Yao Dreams car deal, which was also really big at the time, and again, a really fascinating aspect of the season. And again, Dreams as a character is a really fascinating character on this season, and how complex he ends up being. Well, we also get a really impressive win from Earl, who, while not the most riveting TV, still, again, has an interesting run this season, and does have his moments, to where, I think as a whole, I like Fiji. I like it more than most people. I do think it's a solid season. I think the post-merge in particular is pretty strong. For a while, there is that lull in the middle from the Horsemen just going out. Even then, again, you got Alex flipping on Mookie, which is interesting, where really it's just the Alex boot episode itself that's kind of mundane. But still, I think it's a season that has a lot of interesting things happening throughout. It has a lot of wacky characters. But again, while it does also have an equal amount of duds and has a really dumb twist at the very beginning of the season, I feel like it's still a season that, again, I personally connected with. So again, it's enough to be here number 28. Now number 27, we're moving back to the new era of the show with a season that might be a bit controversial. The fact that it's this high, this being a season that is not particularly well liked by the general Survivor community, where you see a lot of people claim this is one of the worst seasons of the show. Yet this season that I've always personally liked more than most people, despite its issues, and that is Survivor 41, the first season of the new era, to where, again, I get a lot of the criticism for this season. I get that the editing is pretty bad at points. I think the edit is very unbalanced. I think the edit also is primarily focused on the advantages and new twists that were added to the new era, to the point where it does lessen out on the characters of the show and leads to a lot of dynamics not even properly explained. Again, the fact that Erica and Heather don't even get focused on the show until post-merge, despite being one of the most important relationships to the season, is kind of insane. Along with that, also people criticize Erica's winter edit, which has her being near invisible throughout the first half of the season, only for her to really start to pop towards the back third of the season. And that is something that I get the criticism for. However, I actually don't mind it. Where I think this might be a bit of a hot take, I actually like Erica's winter edit. Again, to me, the winner does not need to be the main character of the show. The winner does not even need to be someone that is primarily focused on the show. And I think to have a winner that is simply just shown when necessary, like Erica, I think is interesting to see here. I think it kind of shifted the overall view of winter edits in Survivor history to where, while again, I think winter edits have been a bit more stable since then, outside of Gabler, I do feel like Erica still has this really fascinating edit on this season. One where, again, like, the signs are there early on. There are these confessionals do set up her eventual win, but I feel like the fact that it isn't as in your face as many of the other winter edits is, again, interesting to me. I actually do like this shift here. Where, while obviously I think for Erica herself, it would suck to see you be a bit under-edited on your own winning season. I also feel like it makes sense considering Erica's game position. Again, Erica is someone that wasn't particularly important to how a lot of the game played out until the point where they start to give her a lot of content, which again, I think at the end of the day is probably just a ramification of them having to spend so much time early on setting up all these new era aspects of the show, to where they decided to not even bother portraying Erica consistently. But I still think it leads to, again, an interesting edit for her. I also feel like it leads to an interesting aspect of the season, the fact that Shan is essentially the main character. This person that goes out at the final 8 is essentially running the show game-wise, but also running the airtime of the show. And to see that person getting taken out mid-merge is also a fascinating aspect of this season. Now, again, this season does definitely have criticisms to be had. Again, I do think, again, the edit being so focused on advantages and the new twists, again, is not great. Though I also feel like, again, for this being Survivor 41 in particular, it's the first season back after the pandemic, and it's supposed to be the start of the new era. I feel like it made sense how the season was portrayed here, and even despite that, I feel like there's some great character moments through the season, where, again, early on, again, you have JD and Brad, two of the best pre-merge characters in recent history, and you also get some really interesting gameplay throughout this season. Again, Shan and Ricard really blowing through the entire Ua tribe, I thought was interesting to see, and how they navigated through that. Also, again, the Sydney Boot tribal, I think is still one of the best tribals in the history of the show, where, again, we get this very tight vote where Sydney barely gets taken out there, but mixing that in with the fact that we also get the knowledge is power play, and Liana completely misplaying is also really interesting TV. And we also get the Shan boot, which is a really great episode, one of the best episodes in the new era, at least to me, having a much higher in the season than what it seems like most people. I think this is the type of season where if you look at the season holistically, then I could definitely get a lot of the criticisms of it, but when you look at it like piece by piece, I feel like there's a lot of good pieces here, especially in comparison to a lot of the new era seasons that come afterwards, where straight up, again, this is a higher ranked season than any of the other seasons in the first two cycles of the new era. And a lot of that comes from the fact that, despite the fact that it has these new aspects of the new era, I feel like it's portrayed more similarly to older school seasons than the future new era seasons, where, again, we still get these wacky characters here and there. We still get this hyper-strategic gameplay. We still get live tribals, something that somehow goes away following this, to where it kind of gives off this vibe of having this like middle school season to it, just, again, with the added layer of all these advantages and twists that skew things. But I think at the end of the day, again, I like Survivor 41 more than most people. I think it actually probably has the highest level of gameplay than potentially any of the new era seasons, to where I get the criticism for 41. I do think the editing's a bit of a mess. I do think the casting may be a little bit hit or miss, but I do think as a whole, this is a still solid season of the show from my point of view, and it is here at number 27. Now, number 26, going from one new era season to another, this being the most recent season on the board, we do have Survivor 46. And I will say, as a whole, I was very conflicted on where to land 46. I did feel like 46 is a season that is kind of the story of two halves. I think the first half is bad, well, outside of the premiere, which was pretty great, largely due to Jelinski. I feel like the pre-merge of the season is very lackluster, and even the mergatory episode's really bad, where I just feel like the season up to that point is extremely mundane. Yeah, I think from episode 7 on, the season gets better, but still rarely hits those high highs that you would expect from a lot of the top tier seasons, where I do think the Tevin Boot episode in particular is an all-time great episode. I think the Hunter Boot episode is also a very good episode. However, beyond that, the rest of the episodes are kind of just good. I think the Tiffany Boot episode is fine. I think the main thing propping that one up is Liz's meltdown, but if it weren't for that, I think that would be kind of a lackluster episode, really, where the Tiffany blindside would have been so foreshown. The Venus blindside also was kind of foreshown, along with the fact that the Q blindside was pretty foreshown. So again, obviously a major aspect of this season is constant talk about how people are blindside of idols in their pockets, and we're getting so many blindsides, but like, that's not interesting to me to see people being blindside of idols in their pockets. That just means there's untapped potential with the season, and the fact that these people could have played their idols to make big moves, but they just simply didn't. Though again, 46 is a season that I think my opinion on it is higher now than what it was even at the time that the season finished airing. I do feel like it's a season that, when it finished airing, I think I did say that 41 would be better than 46. However, I think as time goes on, I think I recognize that 46 is better. I think 46 is essentially a better version of 41. I think they are actually somewhat similar seasons. I think the level of gameplay on these seasons are not that far apart. I think both of these seasons kind of have this like middle school Survivor feeling to it, to where again, despite having these like new era aspects, it still has these like really insane characters, these really big character moments, with this season in particular being able to demonstrate a lot of that due to the 90-minute episodes, which I mean, to be fair, is a detriment to it early on. The fact that there's like nothing going on in the entire pre-merge, yet we have these extended run times anyway. But again, it really works to its benefit in the post-merge. And again, I think by the end of the day, Survivor 46 ends up being a largely entertaining season. Again, you get one of the most insane characters in the history of the show in Q, and some other really entertaining characters from the likes of Venus and Ben and Liz and Tiffany and Tevin and even Soda, and got some really interesting early boots and likes of Jem, Jelinski, Banu. Though I think an issue for me with this season is the overall outcome. I do think the outcome of the season is one that is very foreshown, but also I think is a bit of a mess, to where it feels like a lot of the foreshadowing for the season doesn't really even line up to what actually ends up occurring on the season. While also, again, the Kenzie winner edit was just so apparent at the time, to where that kind of sapped a little bit of the suspense of the season for me as well, to where mixing that in the fact that, again, we get a pretty lackluster beginning to the season. I also feel like the tail end of the season is also just kind of okay. Again, it's an inconsistent season for sure, but I do think there are very strong aspects to the season, particularly in the middle portion of the season, with, again, Q just being an all-time great character, really being one of the sole reasons why this season is elevated as high as it is, to where, again, I think at the end of the day, it essentially is a similar season to Survivor 41, yet I think it's benefited from a better overall edit, which leaves it here at number 26. Now, number 25, we're moving on to a more recent season of the show, a season that I am very conflicted on, where I was relatively low on this season at the time of my last video. However, I then went a bit higher on it by the time I made my global season ranking, yet here I am now a bit lower on it again, and that season is Survivor Edge of Extinction. And Edge of Extinction obviously was the most recent season at the time of my last recording, to where, again, considering the negative reception of the season, I think that kind of did paint a negative taint on the season for me. However, again, as time went on, again, my opinion of the season went up. I did feel like it was a very unique season. Obviously, the win from Chris Underwood is a very unique situation to happen that, again, I think is moderately interesting, to where while people do criticize the season for, the entire season doesn't matter until Chris comes back, I don't necessarily agree with that, where I think a lot of what really bolsters Chris's storyline at the end is him taking down Rick Devens, this person that most of the season is spent propping him up as this formidable foe, to where, again, I do think the season before that, again, still matters, and I think through that we also get, again, some pretty good blindsides along the way. Now, I will say, I think Edge of Extinction is probably too hyper-aggressive of a season, where I think it's to the point where it does feel kind of game body at points, it does feel kind of soulless at points, but it is still a season with the dynamics just constantly shifting throughout the entire post-merge, where, again, it does go unexplained a lot of the time, which is definitely a criticism against the editing of the season, yet I do still feel like it leads to a lot of intrigue. Where, again, we get these blindsides constantly throughout the post-merge. Again, Joe gets blindsided, then we see Eric get blindsided, then we get this big live tribal that I always found really interesting, where Julie gets taken out. We also get the Kelly blindside, which is a fantastic moment, only for that to immediately backfire on War Dog, and then only for that move to then backfire on Ron, to where, again, it is a really interesting series of blindsides, one after the other, But also, I feel like the pre-merge is pretty strong as well, where, again, you get great characters from the likes of Reem, you have Keith, who I've always liked, Big Wendy is a great character, you get a big blindside from the Chris Underwood foe, and in general, I really like most of this season. I do think it's a largely consistent season. Obviously, the things to detract from it are Edge of Extinction, the fact that Edge of Extinction exists, that allows Chris to come back at the very end of the game, which, again, can be looked at as unsatisfying, yet I personally don't mind it as a one-time thing in the series. But even then, I think there were interesting moments on the Edge. Again, we do get arguing between and Reem and many of the newer inhabitants at points. We get some interesting advantage hunts early on this season, particularly the one where Keith goes out on his own and the others track him down. And again, I think there are good moments from the Edge, even though most of them are relegated to the pre-merge. So where, again, I think Edge of Extinction this season, I like more than most people. I get why people like really hate the season or are super low on it. Yeah, I feel like also I struggle with putting it much higher on the list at this point, simply because, again, I do think the overall editing of the season is just very strange. Not even just in the fact that, again, Chris comes back at the end and wins, but also the fact that, again, the strategy of the season is not really explained at many points in the season, and mixing that in the fact that, I think, ends up being a pretty unbalanced edit, and one where, again, there are points where it can feel very game body, which, again, leaves it as kind of a middling season for me. It is here at number 25. Number 24, we're moving on to a season that is probably one of the most average seasons in Survivor history, a season that got a lot of flack at the time that it aired, and I get why it did, though I don't think it was nearly as bad as people say, and that season is Survivor Heroes versus Healers versus Hustlers, which is obviously a ridiculous theme, and the overall branding of the season is just kind of dumb, but the season as a whole, again, is a solid season. It's a just typical 3-tribe season in this era of the show where, again, you would still have swaps, and through that ends up being a decently formatted season. I think in general, this is a solid cast. I do feel like by the time we get into the endgame stretch, particularly after the JP vote, I feel like everyone left by that point in the season is a pretty good character, maybe outside of like Ashley Nolan, but still, again, like Ben is a really interesting winner, even though, again, you can definitely criticize his game. I do think he is an interesting winner for the season, even though I think he would have been better as a final juror, which obviously is the big criticism of the season. People don't like the fact that Ben ends up winning the season. They don't like that they have the forced fire making being introduced here, where people claim that it was rigged for Ben, which, again, I don't think it was, but again, obviously it is a very sketchy situation, but it doesn't really detract from my opinion of the season. I really don't think this is that big of a deal to really demerit the entire season because of this last second twist. While the outcome of a season can definitely boon the season, I feel like it very rarely detracts from the season, especially to a significant degree, to where really for me the more important aspects of the season are the path to the end, not necessarily just the actual outcome. To where, again, I think the actual gameplay of the season is pretty interesting, and we do get a lot of flipping back and forth in the post-merge. We do get Ozzy Ben being on the bottom and surviving through idols, which is interesting to see. We also even get early on in the game some pretty decent blindsides there. Alan Ballboot in particular being one of my all-time favorites, and again, I think there's a lot to like from this season, more so than people say. So again, I think it is a mostly consistent season with some really interesting characters. While it's probably a season that hasn't really stood the test of time particularly well, and is probably going to end up being one of the more forgotten seasons when it's all said and done, it's a season that I still personally like more than what it seems like the general consensus is, with it just being a very solid middle ground season for me. So again, that's enough to land it here at number 24. Now, number 23, we're going to the oldest season of the show left on the board. A season that I know that there is some negative reception to it. Some people don't like it as much as what I seem to. Yeah, I've always connected this season, and that season is Survivor Marquesas. And again, I love certain aspects of Survivor Marquesas. Again, I do love the Fall of the Road to 4. Again, this first big flip in Survivor history in the post-merge. Again, that was really interesting to see. I do like this very dynamic end game to where you have this situation where it's a 2v2 with Kathy in the middle at 5, only to lead to Kathy forcing a tie at the final 4, and then we get Vesepia throwing the final immunity to take out Kathy. Again, the end game stretch of the season is very, very strong. We also get some interesting stuff in the pre-merge as well. Again, the Fall of Hunter is a really interesting storyline for this point in Survivor, kind of being this lesson that physical strength and survival skills aren't the end-all be-all in Survivor. And through that, we also get the birth of Boston Rob as a character on the show, being this incredible narrator that really just pops with his charisma on this season, to where, I mean, outside of his comment about John, which is very icky, he still ends up being a really fascinating character on this season. So again, I like Survivor Marquesas. I know there are people that don't like Survivor Marquesas and find it kind of boring, which, again, I don't agree. And I will say, I do think there are aspects of the season that can be looked at as boring. Again, I do think the post-merge, particularly after the Zoe boot until the Sean boot, again, essentially a 2-episode stretch there, is pretty bad. Also, I think post-swap on Madaramu is pretty dull. Though, again, even at that portion of the game, you get the Rob versus John dynamic and them constantly bickering. We have the entire fall of Gabe, which is also super interesting. And again, he still gets some great character moments along the way, where, again, I think this is still a genuinely good season. Ends up being a essentially in the middle point of this list here at number 23. Now number 22, keeping with the old school seasons of the show, here having one I actually just recently rewatched, one that my opinion on this season probably went up slightly, even though really the season was always kind of in this ballpark. But at number 22, I do have Survivor Vanuatu. And again, Survivor Vanuatu is an interesting season. The fact that it's a very unimportant season in Survivor history. It's one that has very little impact on the seasons beyond this. And because of that, I think it's very easy to forget this season and write it off as a season that isn't good because it's not that important. But I think when actually watching it through and remembering like the core storylines of the season, also some of the characters of the season, it's definitely a much better season than you would remember if you haven't watched it in a while. Where I do think Vanuatu is a season that does have these great storylines. Really Chris, again, being able to lose control at the merge, only to then escape long enough for there to be cracks in the women's alliance and sneak his way to the end. I think all that's a really interesting storyline, all while Chris is also a really entertaining character. I think he's probably one of the best confessionalists in the history of the show, and kind of underratedly so. Also, he has this obviously really entertaining final tribal performance, where again, I think Chris is a really great character in that light, while also we get other great characters. Again, the likes of Twyla and Scout are both fantastic characters on this season. Amy is a great villain for the show. Eliza is an incredible character. Even some of the men from earlier on, like Sarge and Rory, are incredible characters as well, where, again, I think this is a solid season from a character front, even though I do think a good chunk of the casts are also kind of duds. Again, a lot of the earlier boots are not the most interesting TV presences, particularly from the men's side of things, but I still think, again, a very solid cast of the season. Also, I think this essentially being the men versus women dynamic that you would want on the show, where, again, I think the Amazon version of this dynamic was one that just felt a bit too juvenile. Again, a lot of it focusing on the men wanting to hook up with the women, and this is a season where you don't get any of that. I mean, this is a season that is more so just genuinely focused on this rivalry between these two groupings that, again, plays out in the most interesting way here, of having the women really steamroll the men, only from the crumble within each other, leading to Chris sneaking out the win. Again, a really interesting season through and through. Again, some great characters, a great storyline. You get obviously the Leanne Blindside, which is all-time great episodes, where, again, there's a lot to really like from this season. For a while, it might be forgotten in Survivor history, I do really like the season as a whole, and that's why it's here number 22. Now number 21, and continuing on with these kind of middle school seasons of the show that, again, I personally do like for more character moments than gameplay moments, we do have Survivor Panama. And Panama's a strange season here in the sense that obviously we have the Kasaya tribe, one of the most insane tribes in the history of the show, filled with incredible characters throughout that tribe. And Shane Powers, all-time great character. Courtney Merritt, we got Daniel DeLorenzo, who had some fun moments. Even Ars provides some entertainment at points, and obviously you have Cirie, who is an all-time great reality TV character. However, you also do have the Lamina tribe, which was not as interesting outside of Terry, and I guess maybe Austin at points, but obviously that is a weird dichotomy with this season. Now, thankfully, the Kasayas end up running the post-merge, and through that, again, we get some entertainment from them. Again, the entire Bruce medevac is one of the funniest scenes in Survivor history, and in general, again, this is a very solid season from a character standpoint. However, I do think the gameplay of the season is kind of mundane at many points, to where, again, the overall dynamics of the original Lamina tribe were not particularly interesting, even at the original Kasaya tribe. While we do get this insanity at the Bob Dog vote, even the early post-merge ends up being a pretty mundane ride of just an easy pagonging of the Laminas, to where, well, again, the game does pick up a lot by the end. Again, we get the 3-2-1 from Cirie, and really just in general, Terry's run in the end game is also really interesting to see. It still doesn't lead to this season having the most interesting gameplay by the end of it, especially as we do end up getting a kind of lackluster final two of Ars versus Danielle, who are not the two most dynamic personalities in the end game, to where, again, I do think this is kind of a mixed bag of a season. Again, a lot of pros in the sense that, again, incredible characters on this season, some big gameplay moments, particularly a 3-2-1, which is probably the landmark moment here, and again, in general, it's just a pretty funny season, but it also is a season that has a good chunk of duds, and again, entire tribe that is just simply just not that interesting. So for me, it kind of evens out here to being at number 21. Now number 20, we're moving on to a season that straight up is here because of nostalgia. I mean, this is a season that I just personally have a lot of connection to. It's one of my most rewatched seasons of the show. I remember back when I got back into Survivor, I would rewatch the season constantly. So while it is definitely a train wrecky season, it's a season that I've always personally liked, and that season is Survivor Nicaragua. And Nicaragua's a season that, again, there definitely are a lot of people that don't like this season. People that think that's a boring season with a bad cast. And again, while I don't necessarily agree with that, I mean, I do think that there are definitely duds on this cast. I think there are a lot of people, specifically from the older tribe, that don't really do much for the show. And even on the younger tribe, you got some unlikable presences, like the likes of Shannon in particular. But still, I do feel like there are some incredible characters on this season. Again, Neonka is obviously a truly elite character. To her, while she does end up quitting the game, and that does, to be fair, completely halt the season. I think that is definitely a negative against the season. The fact that the double quit is such a big moment on the season. Once the double quit happens, it really ends up halting a lot of the season's momentum. But really, the season up to that point is very strong, largely due to Neonka. But you also have Marty, who's an incredible character. You have Brenda, who's an incredible character. So again, that's part of the issue. The fact that all three of them go out in a row, leading into Endgame with the less interesting people. But even then, you still have someone like Holly, who I think is pretty decent TV. Fabio has a really great underdog arc. And in general, again, there's a lot of wacky things happening on this season. So again, I feel like this is my personal Gabon. And again, when people talk about loving the craziness and hecticness of Gabon, I feel like that's what I personally like from something like Nicaragua, to where, again, it's still not an elite season of the show for me. It's still not in my upper tier on the list. It's barely in the top half of seasons. It's just a season that, again, I have a personal connection to. I've watched this season numerous times. I do think there are some incredible characters on this season, even though, again, there's also a decent amount of duds. And I think it is a season that's really lacking on a gameplay front, to where there's not really this like big gameplay moment outside of, I guess, the Kelly Bruno tribal, but even then, that's not really enough to elevate the season too much, to where, again, it's a season that's purely this high due to, again, personal connection, along with the fact that, again, I really like a lot of these characters, to where I can definitely understand the criticism of why people don't have it as high. But again, for me personally, I've always enjoyed this season, which is why it's here at number 20. Now, 19, we're moving on to what's probably one of the most underrated seasons of the show from my point of view, to where while there definitely are criticisms we had with this season, I think the fact that this is constantly talked about as one of the more forgotten seasons of the show is kind of underwhelming, and that season is Survivor Guatemala. And again, I've always liked Guatemala. Guatemala is a season I really enjoyed when I first watched it. It being a season that also has these really insane characters. While the gameplay on this season is not particularly dynamic, I do feel like this season has some pretty insane character moments. I mean, Judd in general is an insane character. One of my favorite one-time characters of the show, to where seeing his many outlash, particularly the "you have ADD" tribal, is just so incredible to see. Again, that specific tribal is one of my favorite tribals from a non-gameplay perspective in the history of the show. And when mixing that in with the fact that you have a really interesting endgame, particularly one that has Danny sneaking her way to the end in a spot that is pretty unpredictable on this season, I think is interesting to see, even though, again, from a pure storytelling perspective, I think it's a little bit questionable. But even beyond that, we have the first appearance of the Hidden Immunity Idol, which leads to a lot of intrigue and some great character stuff from Judd, but also some great moments from Gary. You do have stuff like the Bobby John Jamie feud, which is really fun, and Brian Corden's a character I've always personally liked. And in general, again, I do think there's a lot to like from Guatemala. I will say I do think the gameplay, again, is not the most riveting in the world, and also, again, half the cast is pretty forgettable. Yeah, I do feel like, again, there are a lot of characters on this season that really stand out for me, and Judd in particular is someone that really makes this season. Because that, for me, it lands here at number 19. Now, number 18, we're moving on to another really great season from a character front, even though, again, the gameplay is a bit hit or miss on this season, though it's a season that is kind of trashed on a bit too much from my point of view from a gameplay perspective, and that season is Survivor South Pacific. And South Pacific, again, is looked at commonly by the fan base as this redo of Redemption Island, where, again, they literally just redo the format of Redemption Island once again. But again, a lot of people look at this as the season plays out the exact same. We have this dominant alliance that runs the show and it's boring, when again, that's simply not the case. South Pacific is a legitimately good season of the show. Again, while it does have Redemption Island, and while it does, yes, have a dominant alliance that runs the show, it's not a boring dominant alliance. Again, it's not like Boston Rob, who single-handedly controls every little thing and completely dominates the screen time to a ridiculous degree, to where, again, even though, again, I personally found that entertaining on Redemption Island, this season's not that. I mean, Coach, yes, obviously does have the most content of this season, but it's not by that wide of a margin. Again, Ozzy is also a massive character on this season. Cochran is a massive character on this season. And beyond that, I still think you have these like standout moments from obviously Sophie, from Albert, from Jim, from even like an Edna, obviously Brandon Hands. It's not like the season is primarily focused on just Coach. And again, I do think we get some great moments from this season. Again, the flip at the merge from Cochran and the reaction to that is all really great. We get the Brandon Hands blind side where he gives up his immunity necklace, which is great. Again, the entire story arc of Ozzy on this season is really incredible as well. And also this downfall for Coach is also incredible. It's where, again, I really like this season. I do get the criticism on paper of the fact that this is, again, trying to redo Redemption Island, having the exact same format. However, again, I feel like this season plays out pretty well considering that fact, where, again, considering we do get a Pagonging at the merge, considering the fact that we do have a decent stretch in the post-merge where the dynamics are not really shifting. I think despite that, again, we get a really insane endgame, some pretty big moves happening there, and also a pretty decent pre-merge, so where we get Jim Rice being a really big player on the original Sabai tribe and making some really fun plays there. And even then, again, some good characters from the likes of Christine, Stacy, and Papa Bear, to where, again, I like this season. I get the criticisms on paper. Yeah, I feel like a lot of those people are probably people that haven't really watched the season recently. So I do think this season has a lot of great character moments, and because of that, for me, it's here number 18. Now, number 17, we're moving on to the final season I have not talked about in any sort of season ranking in the past. At number 17, we do have Survivor 45, my highest rated New Era season, and a season that, again, I do think is a very solid season of the show. Again, it's a season that I really liked at the time. I've rewatched it very recently in the lead up to making this video, and I still really enjoyed the season. I think it is a mostly consistent season from beginning to end. It is a season that has no major down points. I mean, while I do think the Kendra boot episode is probably the lowest point of the season, it's still not an entirely bad episode, where 45 is probably one of the most consistent seasons of the show, where while people obviously were very disappointed early on with the quits, I don't feel like it really took away from the entertainment value of the show for me personally, and if anything, added a unique aspect of this season, with Sean's quit in particular just coming so out of left field, mixing that and the fact that, again, we do get some pretty good gameplay moments. I mean, we do get the Sabaya Tribal, which is all really insane. We get Caleb's Shot in the Dark play. We have Kelly's Blindside, which is propped up as this big moment. We get Emily's Blindside, and we also get the insane Final 5 vote, to where, again, I think there are many points in this season that really stand out from a gameplay front, while also, again, I think we have a pretty solid cast here, to where I feel like most people on this cast brought something to the table. I feel like there's not really a true dud on this cast, to where, again, I like Survivor 45. I do think it's by far the best New Era season. I think it's the only season that doesn't have this massive slow point within it, while also, again, having a strong cast, having strong gameplay, and again, having strong character moments as well. Where, again, we have the entire Bruce versus Katara rivalry. We have the Guys' Day segment, which is so weird. And really, Drew as a character on the rewatch was a really fun presence for me, to where, again, I like a lot about this season. The reason it's not higher is because, again, I do think a lot of these older seasons are more etched in my brain than this season. All of them feel a bit more, like, iconic to me. I think there's definitely a world where this goes up over time. However, as of right now, again, just being less than a year out from the season originally airing, I do have it here at number 17. Now, number 16, we're moving on to a season that I've never been particularly fond of. While I do like the season, obviously, it's this high on the list, I do feel like it's always been a largely overrated season. This is a season that I remember at the time was constantly talked about as a near consensus top 5 season. And in the time since then, again, it does seem like the general perception of the season is that it is a really great season. For all, it does have its detractors, and I think the general community does love this season. And again, I like it. I don't love it as much as other people, and that season is Survivor Cambodia Second Chance, which, again, there are good aspects of the season. Obviously, the entire lead up to this season was just insane. I think some of my favorite memories in Survivor history was the ballot process for Second Chance, where there was just so much hype coming into this season. And again, it lived up to it in the sense that this is a solid season of the show, again, of the all returnee seasons, and this is one of the better ones, to where, again, I do think there's some really great gameplay moments across the season. From the Kelly Wentworth idol play, you got Steven's Blindside, to where he essentially accidentally votes himself out, to where he misplaces vote steal. We have the Sierra vote off, which I always found to be one of the more underrated vote offs in the history of the show. Obviously, we have the No Votes Tribal. Even earlier on, I've always liked the Woo vote off. I do think the season starts off with a bang with the Vetus Blindside. Again, I do think this is a very consistently strong strategic season of the show. My issue more so stems from an editing perspective is the fact that I just think this is kind of a soulless season. To where, again, while there is some strong gameplay throughout a lot of it, and again, a couple character moments here and there, it does feel like a season that is mostly devoid of fun. It feels like a lot of the people here are simply just so into the game and so intense when playing the game, where I feel like people just simply weren't having fun while out there, and through that I think it leads to less character moments. I don't think we get many truly elite character moments from this season, with, again, this season just coming off so game focused, where, again, like for me personally, one of my favorite aspects of Survivor, especially when we're looking at side of the game, is again these fun little character moments that are sprinkled throughout the season. I feel like Cambodia is very lacking in those, to where because of this more game body tone that the season has, I do struggle with putting it higher. So again, while if we're looking at this on paper and looking at the individual vote offs and blindsides that happen, yes, this should be higher on the list, obviously, but I think when looking at it from a more storytelling perspective and also just looking at the general tone of the season, it just simply is not as interesting to me. That's why I have it, again, relatively low for most people here at number 16. Now, number 15, we're moving on to a season that I think is one of the most underrated seasons of the show. I think this season is kind of the antithesis to Survivor Cambodia, which is funny considering it was literally the previous season, and that is Survivor Worlds Apart. And Worlds Apart is a season that I, again, just continue to go up on over time. And it's a season that I just genuinely don't understand a lot of the criticism of the season, where, again, people hate this season. Again, some people call it one of the worst seasons of all time. Even at the time that it aired, people were calling it one of the worst seasons of all time. And again, I don't personally get that. Now, I get the fact that people don't like this cast. People don't find the cast particularly likable. Obviously, the likes of like Rodney and Dan and Will make it far into the game. And people don't like that. However, I find this to be one of the funniest seasons of the show. I think this is a season that has a myriad of really funny character moments. Again, feeling like the opposite of Survivor Cambodia in that light. And having this entire season of Dan Foley, one of the most ridiculous TV characters in the history of the show, and him just getting ridiculous moment after moment across this season is just so funny to me. So where, again, I don't like Dan Foley. I don't think Dan Foley is a likable presence on the show, but he is a humorous presence and one that makes for good TV from my point of view. Even Rodney, again, despite the fact that, again, definitely criticize Rodney for certain statements he makes, even he makes for great TV for a lot of the season. Again, his entire meltdown over his birthday is still extremely funny. And even beyond that, you have fun characters from like Jen and Shireen. Mama C's a really interesting character on this season. Obviously, Joe was likable on this season, which again doesn't age well, but again, at least on this season he came off well. Vince Sly and Max Dawson are two incredible early boot characters. So Kim is a pretty notable first boot, to where, again, I think there's a lot to like from the cast of this season. Well, also, I think this season has one of the greatest single season storylines in the history of the show. Again, the story of Mike Holloway, this guy that runs the first half of the game, only to then completely lose all control in the game, but then proceed to still get through the game by winning challenges, winning immunities, and still having agency along the way, is again a really fascinating storyline for me. To see him overcome all odds to make it to the end, again, I do think makes this season even better. To where, while again it was very foreshown in the edit and even outside the edit, it was kind of given away that Mike was going to go on to win this season, I do feel like this season still is benefited from that. And having, again, one of the most satisfying underdog runs in the history of the show, to where, again, while people, again, will criticize how unlikable the likes of Will and Rodney and Dan are, I think the fact that they are targeting Mike constantly in the endgame can't get him out, and Mike ends up beating them all by the end, again, makes that even more satisfying of a story arc. To where, again, I personally like Worlds Apart. I feel like it is an extremely underrated season of the show, which is why for me it's here number 15. Now number 14. And now we're starting off a stretch here of, again, some of the better middle school seasons of the show for me, especially these middle school seasons that are not in the upper echelon of the ranking here. And let's start off with a season that is also known for a pretty great storyline, along with some really wacky characters, one in particular, and that season is Survivor Tocantins. And Tocantins is a season that I do get conflicting vibes from at this point, where there was a point where, I was kind of middle of the road on Tocantins. However, the time I did my last ranking, I was particularly high on Tocantins. It was closer to my top 10, and in general, I do feel like Tocantins is a season that I do mostly like. I think it's a season that has, again, Coach, who is an all-time great character. Along with that, you have JT and Steven, and their overall arc on this season is very strong. Also, you do have someone like a Tyson, who's a great character. I've always liked Aaron Lobdell. Taj obviously has a great arc. Again, even like Sierra and Brendan bring moments at points. So where, again, I think overall this is a pretty strong cast, particularly from the people that make it deep into the game. I think the issue comes from the fact that I do think the pre-merge is not as great as the post-merge, and the post-merge does have some really great character moments and really great, even even gameplay moments from like the Tyson blindside and even the Brendan blindside, even the coach vote off, I think is pretty interesting. Where obviously, just in general, that episode is one of the greatest episodes in Survivor history, just due to how over the top it is from Coach's point of view. But really, again, I think the pre-merge is kind of lackluster. To where while there is a lot of interesting setup, the storylines for down the road, and we still have, again, the wackiness of Coach and Tyson, and also like Sandy is a great character there. And the concept of the Exile Alliance was really interesting to see. I still feel like it's a portion of the season where the gameplay as a whole is just kind of rudimentary. Nothing particularly interesting is happening there, especially from a like vote off perspective. And I think also a lot of the people booted early on are also not the greatest characters in the world. So really as a whole, I do have kind of conflicted thoughts on this season, particularly in the fact that I feel like I struggle with really looking at this as a truly elite season of the show, despite the fact that I think the individual pieces on this season are really strong. Again, some incredible characters, some pretty good gameplay moments, and a really great overall storyline that, again, makes it feel like it should be higher on the list. Yeah, I've always struggled with truly justifying a higher placement on this list, which is why at the end of the day, I did leave it here at number 14. Now at number 13, we're moving on to a season that gets a lot of mixed reception. I think there are some people that rank it relatively high. There are some people that rank it all the way towards the bottom, to which I can understand both of those perspectives. Yeah, again, obviously I have it relatively high here. And at number 13, I have a season that I've always personally liked, and that is Survivor Samoa. And again, I can understand the criticism of Samoa, the fact that the edit is complete trash, the fact that Russell Hantz gets so much more content than anyone else on the season. Somehow almost 3 times the confessionals, of the second most confessional getter, which is just pure insanity. And again, with just how under-edited Galoo were, especially considering a decent chunk of them felt like good characters. Again, I can definitely understand the criticisms of this season, just how it's just entirely the Russell show. Yeah, again, for me personally, the fact that it is the Russell show is kind of what makes it better for me. It's where, well, again, yeah, I'm underwhelmed the fact that we didn't get more of someone like a Dave Ball, who seemed to be a potential all-time great character, and barely got to see someone like a Kelly Sharbaugh or Brett, who's a very important character from this season. I still feel like as a whole, this season just works. And again, I think a lot of it is because the entire season is based around this fall for Russell Hantz. It's allowing Russell Hantz to really dominate the screen time, only to show him proceed to lose. And I think that's what makes this storyline a lot more interesting to me, where I think had it been Russell just dominating the game and winning at the end, it would not be as interesting of a season. Again, it would have been like, again, probably on par or something like a Redemption Island, probably a bit better because I do think there's probably more consistent gameplay moments on this season. But still, again, it would not be a particularly high rated season if Russell went on to win. What makes this a lot more interesting is the fact that, again, Russell loses. And through that, again, I think makes his overall edit that much more fascinating. And makes that the fact that, again, I think there are some fantastic gameplay moments on this season. And again, the early post-merge is just really interesting to see. Again, the Eric Cardona boot, followed by a Kelly Sharbaugh getting idled out of the game. And then we have this full flip against Laura Moret, with her being taken out, only for full then flip on John Fincher the following vote. And even though we get to like a decent pagonging at that point, even like Monica's exit from the game is really fiery, with her getting to an argument with Russell on his way out. And even in the end game, again, we have this underdog arc from Brett, to where I do think, again, that's probably actually more of a negative in the sense that obviously Brett's edit up to that point was severely under-edited, to where it never felt like it was actually going to happen, that he was going to go on the win. But still, it ends up being interesting to see here, to where, again, I like Samoa. I get why people don't. However, I do think, again, just how focused it is on Russell in particular, and really going through every little thought that he has as he plays a non-winning game. Again, I think it's an interesting concept here. Or again, just him in the premiere alone is some all-time great character stuff there. So again, I think this is a season that lives and dies with Russell. It depends on how entertaining you feel like Russell is, to where obviously if you don't like Russell and don't think he's particularly entertaining, then you're going to hate this season. But as someone that does find Russell very entertaining and is very enthralled by his losing trajectory in the game, I do end up having Samoa here at number 13. Now number 12, and at number 12 we have a season that I've always been very conflicted on what I think of this season, largely in the fact that obviously I think it's a good season. I've always thought it was a good season, yet I do struggle with landing it really at the top of the list, which is the reason why it is at number 12 here. One, the fact that I think there are more similarities between it and Samoa and Tokajin's than the seasons we're going to be talking about later, but also the fact that while it is a very consistent season, it doesn't have these massive high highs, and that season is Survivor China. And again, China is a season that I've had in my top 10 in the past, and I do think it is a great season. It is a season that has some really great characters from the likes of James and Courtney and Todd and PG. I mean, John Robert is entertaining, even though very unlikable. Even earlier on, you got someone like a Dave Cruiser, who's an incredible character, to where, again, this is a very fun cast. Again, there are some great character moments from this cast. I mean, the Jamie fake idol play is something to know. The entire throwing of the immunity challenge. Episode 5 is really funny, where just in general, while again very unfair, I think that twist ends up leading to pretty good TV from the Zanhu side of things. And as we get these big blindsides from, again, JR's blindside and obviously the James blindside, which is the hallmark moment of the season, while also this being kind of the peak of Survivor's embracing of its location's cultures. Again, having China as a location here is really cool to see, and seeing them really embrace the culture and incorporate a lot of the culture into a lot of the challenges on this season is really cool. However, I think my gripe with this season, in terms of comparing it to the seasons that are amongst the best of the best, is that I think this season, for me personally, has always been one I just never really fully connected with. While it's a season I can fully recognize as a great season, I think it is a largely consistent season through and through, with an incredible cast, no major slow points in the season, and again, some great individual moments. It's just simply a season that I just never fully connected with. Again, every season from this point forward is a season that I feel like I have a personal connection with, while China is one that I don't really feel that way, despite, again, recognizing the quality of the season. And through that, again, it always has led me very conflicted on where to land this season. Again, a season that I think on paper is amongst the best of the best. A season that, again, I think on paper is probably in my top 7 seasons. But it's also just a season that's not very personal to me. It's a season that, straight up, I've not rewatched in one of the longest times at this point. One of the few seasons I've not watched since the last time I did my season ranking, along with the fact that it's also a season that I haven't watched that many times even when I got back into Survivor. To where, again, I've still watched this season numerous times. It's still probably one of my lesser watched seasons of the show. So, where, again, I think that is definitely something factoring in here. My lack of personal connection to the season, as, again, I think on paper it should be higher. But again, this is my list. It is a list based around my personal connection to these seasons, how much enjoyment I personally get from these seasons. And through that, again, I think to be truly genuine to myself, I feel like I struggle to put China much higher on this list. So because that, for me, it's here number 12. Now number 11. And here we're having a season that did jump up a few spots, to where, again, it's a season that I think on paper, again, is probably worse than Survivor China. However, it's a season that, again, I just have more connection to. I've watched more times. I was more invested in this season, partly due to the fact that I was there as the season aired, and was genuinely shocked at how good this season was. And that season is Survivor Blood vs. Water. And again, I think Blood vs. Water is a season that, again, I think you can genuinely criticize its placement on this list. I think it's a season that being higher in China might feel ridiculous to most people. Yeah, it's a season that, again, I remember just at the time that it was airing, I really adored this season. It's a season that, again, was just so much better than what it should have been. Again, a season that had these returning players coming back and playing with their loved ones. Again, sounds like a massive gimmick of a season, especially after having this long stretch of seasons with returnees on it. It felt like this was just kind of another one of those, another season that was just simply the production not really having faith in putting together a genuine Survivor season, instead trying to create this BS theme and gimmick to the season. But again, it's a season that really works. It's a season that, again, actually takes Redemption Island, which is, again, not a particularly good twist, but actually makes it a pretty effective one that allows for a lot of personal conflicts through people being upset at the fact that their loved ones were voted out. Again, we get some really great content from people hating Brad Culpepper. Brad Culpepper having one of the most interesting pre-merge boot arcs in the history of the show for me. It's where his actual blindside is still one of the best pre-merge tribals in the history of the show. Now, I will say, I do think there is kind of a slow bit of the season. Again, the post-swap is not the greatest, along with the fact that I do think there are a couple episodes in the post-merge that are also not particularly great. Yeah, we do have Sierra voting out her mom, which, again, it's never a moment I personally love that much, but it's still a notable thing about this season. Obviously, fully embracing the theme of Blood vs. Water in that instance. But I think the more interesting aspects of the season, again, the Caleb boot really being this massive flex of Tyson's power in the game, along with the fact that we get the Rock Draw, which is one of my favorite tribals of all time, one of my favorite individual episodes of all time, to where that is really what's propelling this list for me. Again, I do the Rock Draw episode and the Caleb boot episode, two of my favorite episodes, along with the fact that, again, the Brad Culpepper tribal is also very, very strong, along with the fact that, again, just the general theme of Blood vs. Water is just so effective on this season. And again, this essentially being the fans versus favorite season that we should have had with Survivor Caramoan, where while the returnees were still a bit random, we still got some pretty inspired choices there. Well, the better aspect of it is that the newbie crop here was really strong. While you did have a couple duds from the likes of Rachel and, again, you could argue Katie Collins, most other people from the loved one side of things actually made for pretty good TV, to where Blood vs. Water season I just really connected with at the time. And I think when going to revisit it now for this video, I still do really love this season. That's why it's here number 11. Now at number 10, obviously meaning we are now at the top 10 seasons of all time. And we're starting it off with another season that I am conflicted on what I think of it in comparison to Survivor China. Before I get straight up, China was number 10 on my initial draft of the list, yet just something never felt right to me about having it at number 10. Again, coming back to that personal connection, this is just a season I have more of a personal connection to. Another season I remember when it was airing, I really loved. Shockingly so, considering some negative press about the season coming into it, to where, again, this ends up being a largely strong season for me, and that season is Survivor Kaoh Rong. Now, straight up, I think Kaoh Rong probably has a bigger negative for it than the last couple seasons we've talked about, where I think the medevacs in Kaoh Rong are really detrimental to this season. Now, the Caleb one is fine. I do think Caleb medevac actually is a great TV moment and one that elevates the season and is a massive standout point from the season. However, I think the other two are really detrimental. Obviously, Neil medevac is one that stops the merge vote, and through that obviously halts a lot of the momentum of the season. All in the fact that the Joe medevac really harms the season and really ends up halting the progress of the end game as well. And again, those are two really detrimental medevacs. However, I think the rest of the season's really strong. Again, it is a season where we start off with a bang. I do think the overall dynamics on the Braun tribe, well, again, unlikable at points, I thought were really interesting to see. Where again, we had this tie vote at the first tribal between Darnell and Alicia, with Darnell being sniped out of the game there. We also get an incredible episode 2, where we have Jennifer Lanzetti going home after having this meltdown at tribal. We get some other decent vote offs like the Liz Blindside, the Peter Bagenstos vote off, where we have Aubrey crossing out Julia's name. A really strong early merge portion to the game, where again, I've always loved the back-to-back stretch of the Nick Myrano blindside, followed by the Debbie blindside, which I think is one of the most underrated blindsides in the history of the show, where that tribal in itself is one of the all-time great tribals for me. And again, following that out with the Scott Baller blindside, which is obviously the more talked about moment of the season. And again, obviously I do really like it, even though again, I think the Debbie blindside's better. But again, that is a 3-episode stretch that is really strong. Now again, the season does not necessarily peter out following that. That was definitely on a slight decline through the next following episodes, but yeah, I still think we got a very interesting result. Again, Michelle winning against Aubrey is still one of the most controversial outcomes to any season, and in general, again, I do really like this cast. Again, it's a cast that has some really likable and rootable figures from the likes of Aubrey and Sydney and Michelle, but also has some really great villains. Again, I think Scott and Jason, while again very unlikable at points, are two of the best villains from the show in recent years, even though again this was actually quite a while ago at this point. Also, Ty is obviously an incredible character on this season, really a standout one at the time. So again, I think there is definitely the criticism of, again, should China be higher because it's more consistent, there's less issues. So again, with Kaoh Rong, I do have these minor issues with it, but again, I just feel like Kaoh Rong's season, again, I connected to more. I enjoyed it more at the time when it originally aired, where obviously with China I didn't really get that experience. And Kaoh Rong, again, I just always really enjoyed this season, to where while the slow points are definitely a negative here, I do feel like for me, it still ends up cracking the top 10 here. Now number 9, and now we're moving on to a season that has actually jumped up on my list here. It's a season that I think as time goes on, this season ages pretty well for me, even though I also think it's probably an actual negative for its legacy in Survivor history. Again, I think it's a strong individual season, and that season is Survivor Millennials versus Gen X. And again, I like Millennials versus Gen X. And again, I've always liked Millennials versus Gen X. It's always been, at least in my top 15 of Survivor seasons, I've always held it in decently high regard. However, I feel like outside of when it was originally airing, to where I was very high on it then, I feel like this is probably the highest point I've been on Millennials versus Gen X. To where, again, having just revisited aspects of this season, I think this is essentially the season that Cambodia wanted to be. It's a season that, again, has this more game body nature that Survivor Cambodia has, but still has a lot more character expressed through its game bodiness. You still get this really intense, hyperactive, strategic gameplay with some really incredible vote-offs in this season. Again, obviously you get the rock draw, which is just pure insanity there. Even then, like, the Zeke vote's pretty good, the Will Wall vote is pretty good, the Sunday vote is pretty good, the Jay vote-off is pretty good, even though, again, it's inevitability, but again, still fun character-wise with him going out with the fake idol. Even earlier on, you have the Mari Takahashi blindside, you have Lucy being idled out of the game, you have the Michaela blindside, the Figgy vote-off is pretty good. Again, I think there's a lot of really strong vote-offs. However, even beyond that, again, also has a good chunk of character stuff as well. Again, Jay's fake idol play, I think, is still a really fun moment. The montage of everyone saying that Jay as an idol is also a really fun moment on this season. Overall, I think there's some great character arcs on this season. I think Adam has one of the most heartbreaking heartbreaking but also riveting storylines in the history of the show. Him playing for his dying mother that sadly passed away immediately after he got home, and seeing him deal with that on the island again is just really interesting TV to me. But even then, you have the personal growth arc for David and him turning into this really great and confident player by the end, which is fun to see. Again, to me, I think there's a lot to like with Mission X, to where while again this is commonly talked about as a very game body season alongside Cambodia, I actually feel like this is a season that excels beyond that. I think it utilizes its theme a bit more effectively, even though again also does lead to some ridiculous questions at Tribal, but also again provides better character arcs, in my point of view, from Survivor Cambodia, while also, again, having more individual character moments and also the same level of really interesting gameplay along the way. To where, again, I think Militia Next, for me personally, is at least the season that does what Cambodia set out to do, to where, while, again, I don't love the precedent that the season has in Survivor history, where I do think it is from this point on that Survivor does become more focused on casting massive fans of the show and always wanting this hyper-aggressive strategic gameplay, but I still feel like this is a season that really excels above all that, which is why I do have it here at number 9. Now number 8, and I think this will be a very controversial placement for this season. It is a season that I absolutely adore. I get a lot of the criticisms with this season. There are many people that have this in the bottom half of seasons. People that look at this season as a massive disappointment. And again, I can understand why people have that point of view. I just don't care. And at number 8, I do have Survivor Winners at War. And Winners at War is obviously the last season that we'll be talking about that was not on my original season ranking, but it's also a season that I talked about in my global season ranking. When I talked about it there, it was kind of middle of the road. It was not this high on the list. However, since then, I've actually rewatched this season numerous times. We're at the point now where Winners at War is actually one of my most rewatched seasons of the show, and a lot of that comes from my adoration for this season. To where, again, I get the criticisms of the season. People are disappointed by the boot order. A lot of the big names go out early, and through that, we're left in the end game with, again, a not as interesting crowd, where obviously a lot of people don't like Sarah or Ben, and Denise ends up coming off underwhelming on this season. Obviously, people don't like Nick, and again, I get why people are very underwhelmed by the end game stretch of this season. However, again, I personally like a lot of the endgame stuff. Obviously, I'm a massive Tony fan. I obviously love the This Is Extortion episode. I think it's one of the greatest episodes in the history of the show, and it's obviously this massive showcase of Tony as a character and also a player. Well, again, we follow that with the Kim Spradlin blindside, which is also one of my favorite vote-offs in the history of the show. And even before that, again, I personally love the second Tyson boot episode, the one where, again, while the overall vote-off isn't properly explained, because again, it was very difficult to due to the fact that it was due to a live tribal, I still think the entire sequence of events during that tribal are really insane, along with the fact that I love the family visit on this season. I get why people don't like it, and typically I wouldn't like it. Yeah, I think it really brings us to the greater point about Winners at War for me, in the fact that this is a season that is better than the sum of its parts. It is a season that is, on paper, not the greatest season in the world, obviously. On paper, I very much stand by its placement towards the middle of the list. Again, it is a season that, while there are some great gameplay moments from it, again, the Sandra blindside, we have the Sophie blindside. Again, I've always liked the Kim blindside, I always liked the Tyson blindside, I've always liked the Ethan blindside. I also obviously really love the Adam in the podium moment. So again, there's a lot of notable stuff from this season, but there's also, again, some less interesting figures making it towards the end. And obviously, the Edge of Extinction exists, and in general, this is a season that is pretty sloppily edited, largely due to the fact that they just simply didn't have enough time to really show everything in the way that they wanted to where also mixing that in at the introduction of fire tokens on this big legendary season. I can understand why people don't like this season. However, for me, the true strength of Winners at War is how much of a celebration of the series it is. To where, obviously, yes, you can criticize the fact that, again, because they added the Edge, because they added fire tokens, you can say it isn't a celebration of the series. It's actually the opposite, and them trying to shake up the original format of the show. And again, while I think you can make the argument more so for fire tokens, I do think the Edge of Extinction is actually something that, in retrospect, is actually good on this season. Where, again, I don't stand by the Edge of Extinction as a whole. I do think the Edge of Extinction is a terrible twist I never want to see again. However, I do think for Winners at War in particular, while again it's underwhelming to see this sort of twist on a season that you would obviously want a more natural format, I do think, one, it doesn't come off as egregious as Tony still wins the season, where if Natalie had won the season, I would probably have very differing thoughts on this. But even beyond that, I do feel like the fact that we got this essentially epilogue to a lot of these player stories is, again, just incredible to see. Again, the fact that we got more of Ethan, more of Boston Rob, more of Amber, more of Parvati, Tori and Tyson and Natalie. Again, these people that just simply would have been gone from the show so early on. These massive legendary figures of the show, and to see them actually stay the entire stretch of the season and really get to conclude their Survivor careers in a mostly satisfying way was, again, worth it for me. So I really just love these moments from the Edge challenges. First, in the fact that, again, Buster Rob makes this big speech about how the old schoolers had no chance. And on the final Edge of Extinction challenge, just in general, the overall farewell to all the players and all of them talking about what they got from Survivor. Again, all that is just incredible to see. Again, I love how much this season really embraces the stories of these winners, gives them their due. Feeling, again, like this celebration of the series. Feeling like a season that isn't even a real season of Survivor, to where genuinely I do not even care about the season of Survivor on this season. To where, again, that is a lot of the criticism of this season. The fact that, again, the boot order sucks. The gameplay was not on the caliber of what you would expect from a all-winner season. I don't care. That is not what I'm watching this season for. What I am watching this season for is for this full celebration of the series. Something that, again, we saw them do so many things that they have never done in the past to celebrate the series. Again, constant talk about pre-game relationships, having the entire cast, entire families being flown out there, which even within that includes a lot of references to previous seasons. Just in general, a lot of talk about each of these winners' previous runs on the show, which is so many callbacks in the editing of the show to where, again, I love Winners at War. I get the criticism for it. However, I don't care. I don't feel like this is a season I'm even looking at as a proper Survivor season. I am looking at it as a celebration of the show. I'm looking at it as this big anniversary of the show, to where I think when you're looking at it from that point of view, I think it does largely reshape your overall view of the season, to where mixing that and the fact that, again, Tony wins this season in a really fascinating way, making a player as insane as Tony Velachos in the conversation for greatest Survivor players of all time. So again, I think that's another thing that really adds this season for me, to where, again, I love Winners at War. I don't really care if you don't. It's here at number 8. Now number 7. And now we're at the top 7, which, again, for me is the top tier of this list. I mean, these top 7 seasons are the same top 7 from the last time I did my season ranking, even though some of the placements are slightly different. Now, at number 7, we're starting off with one of those placement changes, where here we do have Survivor Philippines. And again, Survivor Philippines is a season that I have a lot of nostalgia for. It's a season that I do have a lot of personal connection to. It's a season that got me back into Survivor, where, again, while I watched Survivor with my parents as a kid, I stopped watching Survivor when they stopped watching Survivor, to where they stopped watching Survivor after Survivor All-Stars. And while I saw certain moments from Survivor Palau, again, it took me all the way to Survivor Philippines to get back into the show. So I decided to get back into the show largely because of my love of Big Brother. But obviously, like, getting back into Survivor obviously changed my life. Again, it is a situation where I fell in love with the show. I fell in love with just reality TV in general. Really, up to that point, I largely was so focused on just Big Brother alone, where, again, me watching Survivor is really what expanded my love of reality TV, obviously culminating in the creation of this channel, where, again, I do have a lot of appreciation for Survivor Philippines for really being the season that sparked this love of the franchise. However, I think as time goes on, I do recognize the season's probably not as good as what I initially thought. So again, it's still a great season for sure. Again, it's this high on the list. I think there is some great stuff early on, from the dissolution of Matt Singh to the point where we have this really great tragedy for Russell Swan. And even beyond that, again, Malcolm and Denise obviously survive through that and make it all the way to the end game, which is really cool to see. We also get a lot of drama and Tendang. We get Henner being this massive pariah throughout a lot of the game. We get a really interesting early merge phase to where the Jeff Kent tribal alone is probably one of the best tribals up to that point in Survivor history, being one of the best individual episodes in Survivor history. And really the entire early merge phase, really up until the final 7, is really great. Now, again, I do think the end game kind of slows down a bit. I think once we get to the final 6, really up until the very end, I think the season becomes a lot less interesting, where it's kind of clear where the season's going at that point, with Malcolm being propped up as such a big threat, and Lisa and Scoopin clearly not having the respect to win the game. Also beyond that, I think this is a cast that is, again, kind of middling. Again, while there are some really great characters on this cast, there's also Carter, who, again, to be fair, actually does have a couple humorous moments for how much of a dodo he is. But again, you also have, like, artists, and you have Dana, and you have even Katie, who doesn't bring much to the table, to where, again, there are definitely some duds on this cast. Yeah, again, as a whole, it's still a very strong season. I think it's a season where, again, it is one of the stronger casts at this point in Survivor history, especially after a massive slump from seasons 21 to 24 in terms of public perception. And again, it had some of the most interesting gameplay in years at that point in Survivor, to where mixing that with the fact that, again, the Malcolm Denise storyline's really great. I think there is a lot to like from this season. I do think it's a season that I still do really enjoy, even though I don't really assess it as consistent of a season as I used to, but still a season that I have a lot of connection to, which is why it's here number 7. Now number 6, going on to another season that is not as consistent as some of the top tier seasons, but it's still a very good season that I do continuously grow appreciation for more and more over time. And that season is Survivor San Juan del Sur. And again, I love San Juan del Sur. It's a season that I've always liked. I love the season even when it aired. While it does have a bit of a slow start, I do think by the time of the Jeremy Blindside, I really love this season, with the Jeremy Blindside being one of my favorites in Survivor history. And again, following that up with the West Nail Tribal, which is all really insane. And then we have this really great arc for Natalie for getting revenge in the game, which again is probably an overhyped storyline. She never actually gets that proper revenge for Jeremy, but she does go on to win the game at least, which is all really interesting. With her making some big moves, again, her flipping at the Alec vote and being able to convince the others that was by accident, her blindsiding John Mish with an idol in his pocket, and then her playing the idol to take out Baylor, which is all just insane gameplay, to where, again, the season from the final 11 on really is all really fantastic. Now again, minor issue in the fact that there definitely are slow points this season. I do think the post-swap phase of the game is particularly boring. I don't think there's really that much of intrigue really going on at that point. Along with the fact that I do think the start is also a bit rough, with a lot of focus on John Rocker and Coyopa just not being as interesting of a tribe as Napu, who are a bit overshadowed. But even then, we still get the Drew Christie episode, which is an all-time great pre-merge episode, to where, again, it's still a great season. I understand why people didn't like it at the time. Obviously, I do think with the Blood versus Water theme being reintroduced once again and it being utilized with all newbies, it does just lead to a lot of faulty casting, where straight up, again, I think it's a terrible idea to have Blood versus Water with newbies, as it leads to typically most of these situations being one where one of these people are good for the show, but the other person is someone that doesn't know anything about the show and is simply just there because of their loved one. And again, I think that's an underwhelming aspect of how this season is cast, but there are still some incredible characters here, obviously. Again, Jeremy, Wentworth, and Natalie are obviously all 3 legends of the game at this point, to where, well, Wentworth doesn't have much of a role on this season. Again, still, Natalie and Jeremy really carry this season, to where, mixing that, and again, Josh has a really great run early on. John Mish becomes a surprisingly good character. Same thing with Reed, who is pretty quiet early on, only then really peak at the end. Obviously, Keith Nail is a really likable presence. Again, I do think there's a lot to like from this season, to where, while again, not the most consistent season on the board, a season that I really liked at the time, I still really like it now. Still one of my favorite seasons. It's here, number 6. Now at number 5, and again, my top 5 have been pretty definitive for years at this point. Truth be told, I did actually very much consider putting San Juan del Sur above this next season we'll be talking about, but again, this is a placement that has remained the same. I still stand by this being at number 5. I still like this season, even though also maybe not the most consistent season in the world, and that season is Survivor Micronesia. And again, Micronesia has the greatest post-merge in Survivor history, and it's not even close. I think the post-merge is just consistently all-time great Survivor. Again, you get the Eliza vote off, where we get the "this is not a stick" moment. We get the Ozzy blindside, one of the all-time great blindsides in the history of the show. We get the Jason blindside, another one of him having an idol in his pocket and looking like an idiot on his way out. We then have the Alexis blindside, her getting idled out of the game, with also the show editing that round in a really interesting way. And obviously we culminate it all in the Eric blindside, which again has been a bit overplayed for me personally, but still in a really incredible, iconic moment of the show. So again, the post-merge of Micronesia is just pure insanity. So much great stuff happening in the post-merge. The pre-merge is a bit less consistent. I do like the pre-merge more than most people, though. Again, I see a lot of people talk about how bad the pre-merge of Micronesia is. I don't think it's bad. I think it is still mostly fun. I still think the premiere is a really incredible episode, where while it leads to Johnny Fairplay quitting at the end, again, I still think having Johnny Fairplay back for one episode is really cool to see, along with the fact that it's just seeing a lot of these other players come back was really cool to see. And then even the fan tribe, I think, is underratedly such a disaster, to where a lot of those votes end up being really interesting, even though they're edited in a weird way, where supposedly there was even more hecticness that had to be edited out of the show, with the Mikey B tribal in particular being one that was like edited down because of how votes were going left and right during that tribal and how nonsensical it was. So even at the swap, I think there's still an interesting vote off where we get rid of Joel, though I will say after the Joel vote, I do think the season becomes a lot less interesting. Obviously when Chet goes home, along with him comes really any potential of there being a shift on that side, and with them continuously going to tribal, it again leads to a bit of a rough stretch in the season. But really, again, the season outside that is really fantastic. Again, the entire post-merge stretch is one of the best stretches in Survivor history, and I think this is also a really great cast, where even the fans on this season, while some of them being duds, I think for the most part really made for good TV. Again, Natalie Bolton is someone that was so quiet for most of the season, but again, really peaks at the end to be an all-time great character. Alexis has her moments. Jason Siska, again, while a dodo and also supposedly kind of a dick on the island, was at least good TV. Where again, we have Eric Reichenbach, incredible character. We have Tracy, who is probably one of the most underrated Survivor players in the history of the show. I thought Joel was actually a pretty interesting character. Chet obviously has funny moments. Even Mikey B, I think, is a interesting early boot on this season, to where obviously this season has the legacy of the Black Widow Brigade. We get Harvey coming out of the season looking like one of the best players of all time. We have Cirie coming out of this season looking like one of the best players of all time. So again, there's just so much of Survivor history made on this season. But again, I think it's a strong season. Again, maybe not the most consistent season in the world, though I still do adore a lot of what the season provides, and because of that, for me, it's here number 5. Now number 4, and here we're moving on to the less big decision on this list for me, where I do think 3 and 4 are kind of interchangeable. I think both are very strong seasons, with my opinion on which one is better than the other constantly shifting over time, where through my numerous rankings of all the seasons, I kind of shifted my opinions on these two seasons constantly. Here on this list, I am shockingly keeping with my original ranking. At number 4, I do have Survivor David vs. Goliath. And David vs. Goliath is a really great season. It is, again, a top tier season of the show, one of the greatest seasons of the show. However, having just rewatched, I mean, really, both David vs. Goliath and the next season we'll be talking about, I do think I came out of my rewatches of these seasons a bit more positive on the one that we're going to be talking about at number 3 than David vs. Goliath, where, again, I still love David vs. Goliath. There's still so many incredible moments from this season, yet I feel like my rewatch of the other seasons stuck out a bit more for me. Now, again, David vs. Goliath still has probably my favorite blindside in Survivor history, at least up there in the John Hennigan blindside, which, again, seeing this minority vote split occur was just really interesting to see. And also, just in general, has a really great post-merge phase of the game. Again, having the John Hennigan blindside, followed by Dan Rengering getting idol nullified out of the game, and then we have this flip on King Carl, followed by this Gabby blindside after she organizes vote against Christian. It's all really great, and then we end the season with this underdog arc for Nick, which again maybe questionable now, but I thought was interesting at the time. Just in general, I do think this is a season that probably utilizes its theme the best. Again, having this David versus Goliath theme, and the season really culminating in this David versus Goliath dynamic, with the David beating the Goliaths at the end, I think is again just great storytelling. And in general, again, just the theme of David vs. Goliath is a really satisfying one, with obviously you being meant to root for the Davids. And again, seeing the David win in this story is again satisfying, even though again nowadays maybe not as much considering it's Nick Wilson. But even then, I think early on in the season there's some interesting stuff going on, like the Jessica Pete vote and the Talia blindside, the Natalie Cole vote off, which brings us into the other great aspect of the season, the fact that there are some incredible character moments on this season. Obviously, Angelina is an all-time great character on this season. The jacket moment, the rice negotiation moment, the ladder moment. Again, she just has so many iconic moments on her run here. And mixing out the fact that, again, you also have other great characters from the likes of Christian, from the likes of Davey. I've always liked Gabby. You have Mike White, who's a really fun character. Dan is a good villain for the show. Natalie Cole is an all-time great pre-merge character, to where, again, there's a lot to like from David vs. Goliath. It is a truly elite season of the show. I just think, again, having come out of rewatching both the seasons around this spot not too long ago, I came out of my rewatch thinking of the other one as slightly better, which is why I do have David vs. Goliath here number 4. Now number 3, again, a season I rewatched not too long ago, where obviously not too long ago I did a retrospective of the season, and that season is Survivor Pearl Islands. And again, Pearl Islands is great. It's a fantastic season. Pearl Islands is a season that probably utilizes its non-gameplay or casting-based theme the best. Again, in a series that obviously eventually gets into the point where the themes of the seasons are purely based on how the tribes are divided or on a really gimmicky twist. I feel like for these earlier seasons that obviously are more so based around its location or an aspect of its location, I feel like Pearl Islands really utilizes its theme the best. Again, this pirate theme that really encompasses a lot of the season and really is incorporated into a lot of the creative of this season. A lot of the twists of this season are blended into pirate culture, and through that, again, we get a lot of uniqueness from this season. Again, almost every challenge has some sort of connection to the pirate theme. You have the overall Outcast twist, which perfectly fits into the pirate theme. While again, it was a very controversial moment at the time, it made for incredible TV here, bringing back 2 characters that radically change up the game and make the game a lot more dynamic and interesting, to where, again, Pearl Islands ends up being the most dynamic season of the show up to this point, really taking the strategy that was utilized in Survivor Amazon and taking it to a further extreme. to where we see Johnny Fairplay really evolve on that strategy and seeing him try to navigate through the game alongside Burton as, again, we have all these other duos in the game and essentially having this more voting block style setup to the game. Again, it's all really interesting to see. Again, some incredible gameplay moments from the blind sides of Savage and from the blind sides of Rupert and Burton, even Savage. But again, that's not what makes this season as great as it is. What makes the season as great as it is are its characters. Again, you have Johnny Fairplay, one of the greatest characters in reality TV history. His lie about his grandma will go down as one of the greatest moments in reality TV. While you also have the first appearance of Sandra, with her being also an incredible character here, one that is so prone to getting into arguments. A lot of her obviously taking control during the premiere, when they go to the village, which in itself is such a surreal moment for the show. All that was really fascinating to see, along the fact that we also get Andrew Savage, who I think is a very understated character, to where his leadership of the Morgans early on and his annoyed attitude and a lot of his confessionals has always been humorous to me. But obviously the main character that really popped from this season is obviously Rupert, who I think is just a truly elite TV presence on this season. Sure, well, yes, it is obviously him hamming it up for sure, and there are obviously moments that portray him much more favorably than what it seemed like the reality was. He still is this incredible character, bring so much to the show, especially considering, again, the pirate theme and him essentially looking like a pirate, and him having, again, these incredible moments from him freaking out over Sean losing the spear, him giving this really overdramatic speech about hope at the Trish Tribal, him obviously having the who the hell voted for me moment, which is one of my all-time favorite moments in Survivor, and him also saying so long for my dreams after he's voted out. Again, Rupert just brings so much to this season. Again, I just absolutely love this season. I think there's so much about this season that truly stands out amongst the Survivor lexicon, to where, again, it just has an incredible cast, some incredible individual moments, some incredible gameplay moments, and just perfectly all wrapped into a pretty perfect package, to where I think Pearl Islands is a season that I think my opinion of constantly goes up over time, to where after every rewatch of it, to where for me at this current point, I do have it here at number 3. Now number 2, and again, my top 2 seasons have remained the same. Again, as I said in my top seasons of reality TV, these are my top 2 seasons of reality TV of all time, and my overall opinion on these 2 seasons have remained the same. At number 2, I do have Survivor Heroes versus Villains, and again, Heroes versus Villains is commonly talked about as the best season of the show, and again, it's very, very good. Obviously, it's my number 2. I do think I have more of a personal connection to my number 1 pick, but Heroes of Villains is still an incredible season through and through. Again, kind of the definitive all-star season. It's a season that, for me, gets most things right. Having a really incredible cast with really great characters that also provide some really great gameplay moments. Again, obviously, some of the biggest blindsides in Survivor history, and the Tyson blindside and the JT blindside both come from this season. But even beyond that, I feel like there are some underrated blindsides on this season. Again, I think the Cirie blindside is very underrated and how strong that one is. I think also the Boston Rob vote is one that I've always personally loved as well. Also, the Danielle De Lorenzo vote is really interesting, even though, again, maybe a bit icky. But even like the Candace vote I thought was really fun. Even the Amanda vote, where you thought there was a chance of Sandra flipping, was really fun. And also even the Coach vote is really great. Where, again, I think there's a lot to like from a pure gameplay perspective on this season, but even then there's some incredible character stuff as well. Where obviously we get the return of Coach, who is still an insane character on the season, really hamming up his shtick to an umpteenth degree. We also have Russell coming back on this season and doing the exact same thing again, which was interesting to see. Obviously, Sandra still provides for some great TV on this season, even though, again, she's kind of underrated at points. Parvati has a really great run that will really etch her name in the Survivor Hall of Fame, with her double idol play obviously massively standing out as an all-time great moment. We obviously have the returns of Colby and Jerry, both having very different trajectories, but also both really interesting to see here. We get this great turnaround for JT of him being a hero the first time and turning into a villain this time. Obviously, again, the reappearance of Boston Rob is really great to see, especially considering his rivalry of Russell and what that ends up meaning for Survivor history. Also, the return of Tom Westman on this season was pretty insane. While, again, it doesn't go particularly great for him. Again, seeing him having this underdog run was really interesting here. And in general, Heroes of Villains brings a lot to the table. It brings back some of the most iconic players in the history of the show in a spot where most of them have their time to shine on this season. And when mixing that the fact that we get some of the best gameplay moments in the history of the show, and a really interesting trajectory for the season with Russell going on to lose again, and also obviously the very spirited debate between Sandra and Parvati. Again, I feel like there's a lot to love from Heroes vs. Villains. Again, a pretty definitive all-star season amongst all of reality TV. Again, it's a near flawless season. I think my one gripe with it is I do feel like I would have preferred a earlier merge here. Yeah, if that did happen, who knows how much that changes of the season and its overall quality. Where, again, I think there's a lot to love from Heroes vs. Villains. I think it's an incredible season through and through, and that's why it's here number 2. Now, number 1, the best season of Survivor US to me is still Survivor Cagayan. Again, I still think Survivor Cagayan is still my favorite season in reality TV history, actually, where I adore Survivor Cagayan. Again, it's a season that I remember at the time of it airing. I just had an incredible experience watching. I never could have predicted where this season was going from episode to episode. The fact that Tony is this massive character on this season and actually goes on to win is still pure insanity to me, with him making some really insane moves throughout this season. Again, him flipping back and forth post-merge, where he votes out LJ and Jeffro within his alliance and is still able to gain back the loyalty of his group. The fact that he is able to convince Wu to take him to the final 2 is pure insanity as well. So we're mixing that and the fact that we also get the best merge episode in Survivor history, debatably the best episode in Survivor history, where Sarah Lucina gets taken out in what is a truly insane tribal. And also we get one of the greatest starts to any season, with the Garrett blindside being another of the all-time great vote-offs in Survivor history. And along with that comes so many incredible characters. Obviously, again, Tony being this incredible character, especially for a winner. You have Spencer, who has a really interesting underdog run on this season, alongside Tasha, who has the same thing. You have Cass, who is this massive villain for the show, and that makes for incredible TV here. I've always liked Trish as a character. Wu has always been a likable presence. Always thought Morgan was a fun character. You have these players that seem to have untapped potential, from the likes of Alexis and Bryce, who is really fun TV. And obviously you have Jatia, who is, again, another all-time great pre-merge character, and there's just so much to like from this season from a more practical point of view. But again, just purely going off of my personal attachment to this season, again, I adored this season at the time. It is a season that I really gelled with in pretty much every single aspect. It was a season that I was probably the most riveted episode by episode, constantly thinking about what was going to happen in the next episode of Survivor. Something that, again, I don't really do anymore. Or I don't really care that much about thinking about what's going to happen in the next episode, where outside of, again, obviously just talking about it on streams and engaging in the overall online community, I don't really care that much about the episode by episode nature of the show, where I feel like Cagayan was a season that I was so invested in every little thing that was going on. This being the first season I ever watched unspoiled, not knowing what was going to happen in the season, which probably played a factor as well. But again, I just really adore everything that Survivor Cagayan has to offer, to where while I do think maybe you can gripe with the fact that there are maybe some slower rounds, from like the Tasha boot round, the Jeremiah boot round, even like earlier on, the Bryce vote's not the most riveting TV. Even the Alexis vote is also not that great. Again, I think you can definitely qualm with those sort of things for sure, especially in comparison to someone like Heroes vs. Villains, which might be more consistent. Again, I do feel like for me, the overall trajectory of Survivor Cagayan was one that I was a lot more invested in. This is essentially just coming off as my ideal Survivor season. So again, considering how great the season is in its own right, and then adding in my personal connection to it, it is by far the easy pick for the best season of Survivor of all time for me. But with that, there we go. I mean, that is my updated season ranking for Survivor US. Now, again, moving forward, still planning on updating some videos for the 5-year anniversaries of them. Maybe I'll get around to redoing my global season ranking next year for that 5-year anniversary, though I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sold on that. But yeah, even beyond that, again, just expect more of the same style of content. I'll be continuing to do the same content I've always done. For how much longer, I guess we'll see. But again, maybe expect a redo of this ranking 5 years from now, to where I guess we'll see if I even make it to that point. But either way, that is my updated ranking for every season of Survivor US. Thank you for watching.